der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Drum links, zwei, drei, drum links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich in die Arbeiter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links, zwei, drei, drum links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich in die Arbeiter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
In our history, the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Lenin, had led a revolution that would establish the first communist state of the world. During their civil war with the White Movement, the conflict had spilled over into Poland. The Soviets were seeking to connect with the ongoing Spartacist revolution in Germany. Their hope was that if they could connect with each other, they would be able to spread the revolution to Europe. However, the Spartacist uprising had failed, and the Polish had managed to beat back the Soviet advance. During the armed conflict, Trotsky, leader of the Red Army, was in contact with Hans von Seht, leader of the Reichswehr. Trotsky had promised Seht that if he staged a border conflict between Germany and Poland, he would grant the Germans their eastern territories back. In our history, despite this offer, Seht did not end up staging a border conflict. In the German October timeline, Seht goes through with the border conflict instead of holding back. Poland is defeated and partitioned between the Soviets and the Germans. Weimar Germany's authority vanishes after Seht refuses the League of Nations mandate of Poland. A warlord period begins between separatists, national claimants, and communists. The opportunity for a world revolution was at hand, and the Red Army invaded Germany to support the communist revolts. After a year of fighting, the Soviets seemed to be in an incredible position to spread communism to Europe and the world. However, Trotsky had to sign a peace with the French, as their leader, Lenin, had died, and Trotsky was required back in Moscow to tend to the Union. With such a large USSR, with the industrial regions of Germany under their control, would they be able to industrialize earlier? What will the sudden spread of communism to Central Europe mean for Italy, France, and Britain? How will the lack of a German state impact the ideological alignment of the Germans? Welcome to German October, the third Loredad series. I hope you enjoyed this project. It has required the most research out of any project I've done before. A lot of it has become easier thanks to Serov, who has consulted me with suggestions and added clarification about Soviet politics in this era of history, so thank you very much. Without further ado, let's observe the ramifications of this point of divergence. As mentioned previously, Trotsky needs to leave the German front line and return to Moscow in order to stake his claim to leadership of the Union. However, we've already reached a point where I need to make a controversial claim, that Trotsky had aspired to be the leader of the Soviet Union. Throughout my research, I've heard conflicting claims regarding Trotsky's ambitions towards the USSR. Most frustrating is that he himself claimed different things at different points of history. This is an extremely difficult era of history to understand. I will do my best to present things non-partisan, so please bear with me as we get into this alternate history. Before Lenin's death, Stalin had made an alliance with two other prominent Soviet politicians, Kamenev and Zinoviev. These three made up the Stalinist triumvirate, specifically positioned against Trotsky in order to prevent his ascension to power in the Soviet Union. This alliance was quite warranted, as Trotsky's influence in the Soviet Union was immense. As the organizer of the Red Army and leader of the Petrograd Soviet, these three had banded together either to prevent Trotsky from coming to power for ideological concerns or personal ambitions to power. The exact determination depends on who you ask, but we will be focusing specifically on the ideological front, as the debate regarding the future of the Soviet Union in this timeline would be an intense ideological debate between the Leninists and the Trotskyists. And in order to fully understand, we need to understand very important things about socialism. Marx was a philosopher in early Victorian Europe who wrote the Communist Manifesto. His theories of socialism and communism has shaped the history of leftist movements through the world, as his philosophy became the mainline socialist position in a world where socialism was heavily split between several different ideological thinkers. Vladimir Lenin was a Russian citizen who grew up to be a communist revolutionary after learning about Marx and his theories. While Marx had predicted that communism could only come from socialism, and socialism could only come from capitalism, Lenin had managed to organize a communist revolution in a society that was considered feudal. This significant achievement had prevented the accusations of revisionism, and led to Lenin's Marxism to be called Marxism-Leninism. During the period of unrest in Russia during the First World War, Lenin had published his April thesis, advocating for a two-stage revolution in Russia. This policy was adopted by nearly all of Lenin's followers. However, Trotsky was initially reluctant to join Lenin's communist revolution. This seems incredibly strange. However, once you understand how Trotsky's ideology differed from Lenin's at the time, it'll make more sense. Do you remember when I was illustrating how Lenin adapted Marx's principles regarding the communist revolution and its requirements? Well, Trotsky was so strict a follower of Marx, he did not believe it was possible to achieve communism in Russia, as it was feudal. Despite their ideological differences, Trotsky eventually joined the Bolshevik Revolution, becoming a zealous organizer of the army. Trotsky's determination to organize the army and his performance in conflicts like the Soviet-Polish War were also fueled by his ideology. Since Trotsky believed that Russia could not develop communism, he believed that it was necessary for communism to be spread to the industrial epicenters of Europe. This ideological tenet was called Permanent Revolution by Trotsky. After the miracle on the Vistula and the defeat of the Soviet forces, the dominant ideological trajectory following the Soviet-Polish War was socialism in one country. These two ideologies both wished to accomplish the same thing, but Trotsky did not adopt the socialism in one country position. In our history, due to Trotsky's refusal to adapt to the realities of the Soviet Union at the time, he was isolated ideologically. This left Stalin and his allies to eventually exile him from the country. Trotsky would go on to write many theories and books, antagonizing the Stalinists before being assassinated in Mexico. However, in this timeline, due to the success of the Soviet Union in its war against Poland and then Germany, the Bolsheviks now had direct access to the largest industrial centers of Germany, Silesia and the Ruhr. Now, the debate between permanent revolution and socialism in one country was settled, and the most vocal proponent and the mastermind of the Bolshevik invasion of Germany was Leon Trotsky. Assured by the success of his ideology, Trotsky was convinced that he was fit to rule in the Soviet Union in this timeline. However, Trotsky was still being sidelined by the Stalin triumvirate and would need to return home in order to secure the revolution that he now believed was his success. This meant that Trotsky needed to sign a peace with the Western powers. The Soviet army under Trotsky would meet with the Western powers supporting the German breakaway states in Trier. This location was chosen by Trotsky as a means to show strength, as Trier was the birthplace of Marx. This peace would see several different stipulations being agreed upon. The West would acknowledge the Soviet annexation of northern Germany. The French popped-up buffer states of the Rhineland and Baden-Württemberg would be recognized by the Soviet Union. Bavaria too would be recognized by the Soviets in the West, but Bavaria would be forced to be neutral. This stipulation was incredibly critical for peace to be achieved between the East and West. This is because if the Bavarians were allowed to align themselves with the West, France would be able to make a direct land connection between themselves and Czechoslovakia. All parties would agree to this, but in reality, They had both begun covert attempts to instigate a revolution to become a government friendly to them. Once the treaty had been signed, the Soviets were finally at peace, and Trotsky would embark to Moscow, where he would claim leadership of the Soviet Union. However, in Trotsky's haste to claim leadership, an ideological infection would fester in Germany. Due to the point divergence in its ramifications, a fringe political ideology, practiced by few and to the ridicule of many in our history, would begin to manifest a small but rapidly increasing following in Germany. In our history, and prior to German October's point of divergence, there were many communists in Germany who had so desperately wished to resist the imperialist Entente that they would adopt measures considered by many Marxists to be inconceivable. An alliance with nationalists. Heinrich Laufenberg was the progenitor of this ideology, which would be known as National Bolshevism. During the Spartacist Revolution, some revolutionaries were enthusiastic of this idea with working together with the evils you know in order to destroy the greater threat. But once Lenin had heard of this deviation, he had denounced it, and Heinrich had left the communist movement disgraced. While still denounced, and viewed as incredibly revisionistic, the Heinrich Laufenberg myth would perpetuate with increased vigor as his idea of a German alliance with the Soviets would become semi-prophetic, since the Bolshevik had spread the revolution to Germany. While the political field would be dominated by Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists, and National Bolshevism was banned, the disenfranchised nationalists and petite bourgeois who were soon to be subject to collectivization measures would resonate with this ideology, even if it was only subconsciously. They would populate the ranks of the party, forming a fifth column within the Soviet Union, unrecognized by Trotsky or more senior party officials, as the turmoil of Lenin's succession trumps all other concerns. As Trotsky reaches Moscow, he begins his bid for leadership of the USSR. However, Stalin's triumvirate still holds significant influence. It would surely take any chance they get to diminish Trotsky's influence and prevent him from ascending to leadership. But how would Trotsky legally take over the Soviet Union? In conventional history, we usually think of the leader of the Soviet Union being Stalin after Lenin, but there was a period where the collective leadership was still de jure the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. However, Stalin is still considered the leader at this point of time by most people due to the strength of his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party. For example, the chairman of the CPC was supposed to work directly together with each of the leaders of the Soviet republics of the Union, as a form of collective leadership following Leninist ideals. However, the GSCP was able to remove and elevate any and all positions within the Communist Party. This position allowed for Stalin to improve the standing of his allies, and was key in his bid to gain leadership of the Union after the constitutional revision of 1936, which formalized the GSCP as the head of state of the Soviet Union. So therefore, despite the sheer legendary status Trotsky would have for his victory in Germany, there would be no way for Trotsky to simply claim the position of CPC. Stalin would need to be removed from his position as GSCP beforehand. Thankfully, Lenin, as he was nearing his deathbed, had written a letter outlining his wishes for the future of the Soviet Union. This letter had, in our timeline, advocated for Trotsky. Lenin had said not to hold his hesitancy to join the Bolshevik Revolution against him, criticized several members of the party, and voiced his wishes for the General Secretary position to be granted to someone else other than Stalin. Lenin's last testament had gotten into the hands of the two other members of the Stalin triumvirate, Kamenev and Zinoviev. In our timeline, they had relayed the existence of this document to Stalin as a part of their triumvirate. However, ever since Stalin had become GSCP, he had managed to gain far more influence than Kamenev and Zinoviev, leaving them worried for their future. This worry would be absolutely justified, as years later, Stalin would have these people purged, with the accusation being that they were attempting to put Trotsky in charge of the Soviet Union. In this timeline, I believe that these scorned members of the triumvirate would betray Stalin and align with Trotsky. Their motivations would be very clear-cut. They want to keep their position of influence as equals in a triumvirate, and wish to side with the rising influence of Trotsky rather than Stalin, who had, in their eyes, betrayed the terms of the triumvirate. So when the next party congress would convene, Trotsky and Stalin would face off. The conference, which had ultimately humiliated Trotsky and had him exiled out of the Soviet Union, would instead be reversed, where Trotsky would ridicule Stalin for his failure to listen to orders from Lenin, forcing Trotsky to deal with the devil and only liberate half of Germany. Trotsky would accuse Stalin of attempting to form a fifth column and undermine the revolutionary effort, using Lenin's last testament as a means to depose him from his position, and with the accusations of treason, he would be exiled by Trotsky out of the Soviet Union itself. After Stalin's ordered exile, Trotsky would continue to read Lenin's last testament, which would have been far more in favor of Trotsky due to his successes. This alternate last testament would call for Trotsky to become head of the government, which at the time of the first Soviet constitution would be the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, removing the former chairman, Alexei Rykov. The vacancy of the GSCP would be granted to Karl Radek, who was a major ally of Trotsky during the German October Revolution. Now, Trotsky would continue to consolidate the Soviet Union under his vision, emboldened by the truth of his ideology and the scale of his achievements. With the rise of Trotsky to leadership of the Soviet Union, the capitalist world would tremble. Trotsky's ideological interpretation of communism had called for a global revolution of industrial workers, supported by direct military intervention. On top of this, the financial burdens of the Great War, which were supposed to be alleviated by the German war reparations, were now null and void due to the lack of a Germany to pay them off. The level of crisis that was perpetuating across the Western world would be immense. And yet, despite all of this, French troops supporting the Rhinish and Baden-Württembergian separatist states had managed to fend off the beleaguered Soviet forces. Regardless of the efforts of the Soviet army, it could very well be that the French and British socialists would attempt their own revolutions to split the attention of the army and ultimately lead to their liberation. But even that would be prevented by the stipulations of the Treaty of Trier. Any attempts to trigger a communist revolution in these countries could not be directly supported by the Soviet Union. So the Comintern would advise that the communists of the world continue to organize, but not take any direct action just yet. The Treaty of Trier had ensured that this uneasy peace between the Soviets and the West would persist, giving both factions the opportunity to regain their footing. While both factions would benefit from the truce, the Soviets would benefit far more, as Soviet access to German industry would allow for the economically backwards regions of the former Russian Empire to industrialize rapidly, allowing for the Soviets to return with far more technologically advanced arms to break the defenses of the French and spread the revolution to Europe. Thus, the Entente powers of the Great War would all seek to band together once again in order to properly prepare themselves against the Soviet Union. France and Britain would continue to foster their friendship, despite the natural distancing which occurred following the end of the Great War, and would attempt to reach out to Italy, a former Entente member. However, diplomacy between the former allies would be difficult, as the new Prime Minister of Italy, Yes Man, was quite fashionable and held disdain for their former allies. Before the outbreak of the Great War, Italy was in between two major alliances, the Central Powers and the Entente. Despite signing a defensive pact with the Germans and Austrians, the Italians were eventually swayed to the side of the Entente with the Treaty of London, where the British had guaranteed to the Italians that they would gain these territories if they joined the Entente. However, due to American intervention and Wilson's 14 points, the gained territories were far less, especially in the case of Yugoslavia, a French-supported state among their ambitions of cordon sanitaire at the expense of Italian irredenta. This distrust in the West, as well as fear of a socialist revolution, led to the rise of Yes Man and his fashionistas to power in the state. Italy under Yes Man was a nationalistic dictatorship that sought to claim the territories denied to them by the Western powers, as well as lands off of the British and French that were considered a fundamental part of Greater Italy. This claiming Western territory, their anti-democratic nature, and the distrust that they felt towards their former allies would make diplomacy difficult. But the advent of the Soviet advance into Europe provided Yes Man a unique opportunity to carve out their own sphere of influence. Italian fashion was extremely anti-Bolshevik, And due to the nature of yes man's rise to power, many capitalist nations would start to see this new 20th century fashion trend as one that these nations had ought to adopt. And by becoming a major partner in this alliance against Bolshevism, Italy would be able to promote their fashion amongst the terrified nations of the West, giving Italy the opportunity to act once they are properly industrialized. Thus, Italy would join the British and French in an alliance against the rising power in the German region. Ironically enough, the German October timeline has a more reasonable Stresa front than Project Stresa does. But Italy would also sign other important treaties with Austria and Hungary, seeking to improve their relations, promote Italian fashion trends, and potentially postured themselves against Yugoslavia, whom each had territorial ambitions against. With the aggressive posturing of the Italians against the French and their cordon sanitaire, tensions would increase between the two powers. But with the solidification of the Stresa front, there would be no actions France could take to the Italians and their spread of influence. Only time will tell if this united front would last beyond the vanquishing of the communist threat. But for now, we'll explore the plan of attack of the Stresa front. With the Soviet annexation of Poland and Germany, they had direct land access to the industrial heartlands of Germany. However, it also provided them a significant vulnerability. With the French-aligned states of Czechoslovakia and Romania just next door to Poland, the Stresa front could simply make a concentrated advance into Poland and cut off the connection from Russia to Germany, where they would then finish off the German Soviets before performing a large-scale invasion into Russia herself. This advance into Poland would be supported by the Polish resistance, who had established themselves in Czechoslovakia after capitulating to the Soviet Union. While still very much committed to the ideal of an independent Poland, it was apparent to many within the exiled government that standing alone would not be an option. With the bonds they forged together fending off Soviet advances into Czechoslovakia, the idea of including Poland into the Czechoslovak Union was considered. This Zapadoslavia would be founded after the destruction of the Soviet Union, and would ensure that the West Slavians would never again be subjugated to either Germans, Russians, or communists. While there were still many adamantly Polish nationalists among the ranks of the Polish exiles, this idea of a stronger Central European nation loyal to France was strongly supported by France. For now, however, these were only hypotheticals, and were secondary to the primary strategy of encircling Germany away from the rest of the Soviet Union. Trotsky was fully aware of all the ways that the capitalists could potentially eliminate the workers' state. Thus, he would waste no time industrializing the most loyal of the Soviet republics, Russia. In order to do this, he would bargain with the German Soviet Socialist Republic in order to gain their full material and intellectual support. While this seems like a no-brainer for the good of the revolution, the Germans would be apprehensive. To put a complicated concept simply, if the Germans industrialized the Russians, they would be obsolete. The Soviets would have gotten what they wanted out of the North Germans and would have no incentive to reunify Germany, keeping the status quo. In order to dispel this anxiety of the Germans, Trotsky had promised the Germans that once Russia was pulled out of its feudal roots, the Russians would pay back the German proletariat with a unified German Soviet Republic. With the consent of the Germans, the Trotskyite 5-year plan would begin, with a very large emphasis on railway networks and the industrialization of the former Imperial Russian lands. However, Trotsky's public proclamation of their intentions to invade the German breakaway states had the adverse effect of increasing world tension, causing the weary nations of Europe to band closer together. The world would wait anxiously as the capitalist nations of Europe would one way or another pursue their own 5-year plans in anticipation of a large conflict with the USSR. However, to the surprise of many, it wouldn't be 5 years before another major conflict. It would only manifest 1 year later, with the inciting incident not even being in Europe, but instead, China. It's an alternate 1928, and the Republic of China is in disarray. The ideological fanatics of the Kuomintang under their new leader, Chiang Kai-shek, have staked their bid to national leadership, executing the Northern Exhibition in order to destroy what they would call the Beiyang government. Zhang Zuolin, who had styled himself Generalissimo of the Republic of China, would have just returned from his devastating defeat against the Kuomintang. In our timeline, despite Zhang's incredible influence, he would be assassinated by the Japanese in attempts to install his hedonistic son, Zhang Zuiliang, as the leader of Manchuria. Their hope was that they could use his son's vices against him and slowly gain control over the resource-rich, strategically vital region of Manchuria for themselves. However, once he had become the warlord of Manchuria, he had recognized Chiang Kai-shek as the true leader of China. What resulted was a period known as the Nanjing Decade, where there was only the Kuomintang as a national claimant, with very few warlords attempting to distance themselves, and a middling communist movement which was always on the run. In our history, the Japanese would eventually begin pressuring the KMT further and further with the aim to completely subjugate the young democracy. However, in this timeline, the role of a foreign power attempting to subjugate China would not be the Japanese, but instead the USSR under the leadership of Trotsky. The initial invasion of Trotsky would see Manchuria slowly occupied by the Soviet Union. With this sudden invasion, the entire dynamic of the Northern Exhibition has been thrown off its historical course. But why would the Soviets ever invade China? In order to properly understand this, we must get caught up in Chinese history and understand how the divergences have caused this altercation. For the sake of our story, we'll be focusing on two different governments: the Beiyang government and the nationalist government. This era of conflict began after the Qing dynasty was deposed. A Republican revolutionary, Sun Yat-sen, had managed to gain enough sway politically to force the abdication of the monarchy. However, this was only possible with the support of the Qing army under the leadership of Yuan Shikai. This Republic of China would only last for 3 years, between 1912 and 1915, where Yuan would betray the revolution and proclaim himself Emperor of China. This move was essentially rejected by all, and would mark the beginning of the warlord era, where regions of the government of China would be governed by military leaders with their own armies, essentially operating as small statelets. The Republic of China, known as the Beiyang government, that followed Yuan's failed monarchical restoration and his death, would be marred by intense political instability due to the strength of these warlords and weakness of the government. This instability had allowed for the Beiyang government to fall under international influence. This foreign influence came in the form of large, irresponsibly negotiated loans from foreign investors. One notable example is Duan Guri's acceptance of a significant loan from Japan, which also involved the concession of key ports within Beiyang governmental control. These irresponsible loans would, if unchecked, inevitably caused China to slowly be subjugated by international capitalist forces, which gave rise to the May 4th movement, and soon after, the rise of communism in China. The May 4th movement was the result of a direct reaction from the Chinese populace who rejected the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles. This resistance against the Treaty of Versailles and its focus on anti-imperialist sentiment would soon give rise to the popularization of communism in China, with the Communist Party of China being founded not too soon after. While the rise of a communist party in a major country bordering the Soviet Union would have surely been seen as a good thing, in reality, Moscow didn't have much faith in the Communist Party of China. This may be attributed to China's lack of an industrial proletariat, something that Trotsky and his followers like Karl Radek had believed were necessary for a communist revolution. Due to their lack of faith in the communist Chinese to execute a revolution, a two-stage revolution model was adopted instead. In 1920, after Sun Yat-sen had returned to China from exile and founded the Guangzhou military government, he was approached by Soviet diplomats who wanted to forge an alliance with him. A stipulation of this hypothetical alliance was that he would need to allow for the Communist Party of China to operate unfettered in his state, and as a result, form a united front against the Beiyang government. Sun Yat-sen had agreed to ally with the Soviets, so long as the CCP as an organization was dissolved in favor of alignment with the KMT itself. So in other words, the communists were allowed to be communists so long as they did not organize into a separate party and continued to support the KMT. After Sun Yat-sen's death, and a power struggle for leadership resulting in the pro-war rightist faction of the KMT winning out over the leftist one, Chiang Kai-shek would begin the Northern Exhibition. The Kuomintang's attempt to destroy the Beiyang government and unite China under their rule. As this military campaign was underway, Shanghai was taken by communist militias in 1924. seeing as the Communists and the KMT were in a coalition. When the Kuomintang requested access to the city, the Communists had accepted. But what had followed was a brutal slaughter of the Communists by the KMT. Despite the united front, Chiang would act against the Communists there in order to fully capture the historic city for himself. This betrayal of the united front would destroy it, leading to a period of political instability in China. Chiang Kai-shek's rival, Wang Jingwei, would organize a rival government in Wuhan. This rival government had sought to continue the collaboration between the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communists, while still seeking to adhere to the principles of Sun Yat-sen's ideology. During this split, Stalin had sent directives to his attachés in the Wuhan government, directing them to raise an army of communists, giving them weapons, and demanded to significantly increase communist presence in Wang's rival government. Wang had believed that Stalin was seeking to use his rival government as means to strengthen the communist movement, giving them a successor government directly related to the legendary Sun Yat-sen. Therefore, the Wuhan rival government would disband only a year later, with Wang expelling communists from his rival government and swearing fealty to Chiang, who had successfully managed to destroy the Beiyang government, leaving the Kuomintang as the sole legitimate government of China. This failure to resist the rise of Chiang would ultimately result in Wang Jingwei's exile from China, and, after the Japanese invasion of China, sway him to collaborate with the Imperial Japanese. However, in this alternate timeline, the fate of China manifests in a much different way. Seeing as in 1924, the now leader of the Soviet Union, Trotsky, had used the political instability of Germany, following his manipulation of the Reichswehr, to outright conquer northern Germany for the Soviet Union. Wang would not organize any sort of rival government after Chiang's Shanghai massacre, and would therefore keep the KMT united and far more capable in their northern exhibition. The consequences of Trotsky's political maneuvering had come to haunt him. Trotsky's ideal of spreading communism to as many countries as possible in order to help dismantle the capitalist world order now had a significant delay thanks to the KMT's dismantling of the United Front. Without a fifth column of leftist KMT or a dormant communist movement, the ideal of a Chinese two-stage revolution in the style of Lenin's October Revolution was now impossible. Already facing critique from several party members, but without any political means to silence his opposition, Trotsky was hoping to use a successful communist revolution in China as a means to increase his support base. As the current leader of the CCP, Chen Duixiu, had professed his admiration of Trotsky. Now that the KMT had begun suppressing communists in their own realm, going directly against the united front that had been negotiated with Sun Yat-sen, the Soviet Union now had a reason to outright invade China. The Trotskyite 5-year plan, which had previously been focused on industrialization the RSFSR, had been adjusted to suit the new ambitions of Trotsky. Railroads connecting the East and West would be established for the purpose of supplying their invasion efforts, and the industrial factories, which had initially been focused on improving the quality of life of the average proletarian, had been rapidly shifted to accommodate the expansion of the military. Despite this shift in policy, the leader of the Red Army, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, would request Trotsky for another year or two of preparation prior to acting. However, due to the political pressure, Trotsky would insist that the invasion occur as soon as possible, despite his concerns. After the troops were organized enough, Trotsky had given the order to destroy the false Beiyang and Kuomintang governments and spread the revolution to the Chinese proletariat. The primary war aims of the Soviets in their invasion would be to link up with the Soviet zones, which had been established in response to Chiang Kai-shek's shattering of the United Front. These Soviet zones would be the first victims of Chiang Kai-shek's encirclement campaigns. The Kuomintang would only be able to truly eliminate these Soviet zones via military advisors and military aid. In our timeline, this doctrinal support would be spearheaded by the leader of the Weimar government's military, Hans von Seet. However, as he'd be dead and the majority of Germany was under Soviet control, these German tactics would instead be used against the reactionary Chinese, granting the Soviet Union an edge in this conflict. With the split attention between the Northern Expedition and the invasion from the north, and with the support from the People's Republic of Mongolia, the Soviets had managed to seize all of Manchuria, Outer Mongolia, and Beijing for the communist cause. This rapid success shocked the world and escalated the conflict to a far greater extent. While initially, Western recognition of the true government of China was mixed, there was now no doubt that the Kuomintang had become the eastern bulwark against communism, and thus the Stresa Front would begin heavily supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government, and international recognition had spread across the board. But one nation had prerequisites prior to the recognition of the Kuomintang. The Sino-Japanese War of our timeline had defined an entire theater of the Second World War. The Japanese ambitions to empire had them supporting the Beiyang government economically and militarily. Their ambitions would be foiled by popular resistance, and despite their scheming, would result in the Kuomintang uniting China under a period known as the Nanjing Decade. This decade would be disrupted with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and further pressuring of the Nanjing government would persist until a breaking point was reached. Japan and China would fight an elongated, bitter war of resistance under a second united front, before eventually capitulating to the victorious Allied powers. With this historical precedent in mind, the idea that Japan would attempt any sort of friendly negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek's government is hard to consider. However, given the fact that they had both shared a direct enemy in the communists, there is no doubt that even the imperialist Japanese would change their foreign policy. But if they were to fully recognize this Republic of China, and collaborate in their efforts to push back the communists, deals had to be made. As mentioned before, Japan had attempted to exert influence over the Beiyang government with heavy loans and negotiating treaty ports. However, there were many other attempts to gain influence. An example of this was the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement. In 1918, prior to the founding of the rival nationalist government in 1925, this treaty would have granted the Japanese special permissions to station troops and fortify garrisons against the Sino-Russian border. However, due to the conditions of this secret treaty becoming public, the agreement would never truly take effect. It was another contributing factor towards the May 4th movement and communism spreading in China. Now, the consequences of allowing for communist ideas in China have resulted in a direct military conflict. This level of disaster for the Chinese people could have been prevented if they had allowed for their Asian brothers in Japan to protect them from their hostile neighbor. This propagandic edge would sway many people, including Chiang Kai-shek, to the side of the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek, encouraged by the continued support of the Japanophilic faction of the KMT, led by Wang Jingwei, would agree to a reconsideration of the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement, allowing for Japanese special interests in northern China to be secured in exchange for the direct aid against the Soviet attack. Thus, Japan would come to the side of the Chinese nationalists as a protector and would begin to push back against the Soviet occupation of Manchuria, reinstalling the warlords' control in the region, but with full recognition for the Nanjing government rather than any sort of restoration of the Beiyang government. After the Japanese entry into the war, the Soviet blitz through Beijing to reach the communist militias had stalled. More troops were needed to hold back the Japanese advance. With such a brazen invasion into Japan's sphere of influence, this sort of reaction was expected by the Soviets. What was not expected was the direct collaboration between the Kuomintang and the Japanese. The Soviets had expected a disorganized, warlord-based force defending each of their petty polities, but now they had united all under one government and with the modernized army of Japan to reinforce them. In retrospect, they should have expected this. The Japanese may have defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, but this attacking force was not the backwards Tsarist Russians. These were the soldiers of the Soviet Union, with tactics and experimental armor divisions made with the support of German industry. The logistical failures of relying on a single outdated railroad were now moot, as the 5-year plan had connected more and more of the formerly oppressed peoples within their realms with the most distant eastern allies of the Workers' Revolution, Mongolia. The Mongolian theater was deceivingly vital for the war effort. While major, well-supplied advances into Manchuria were executed with these armored divisions well enough, they were only able to succeed with the diversions of the Soviet cavalry marching through the desert. The Great Wall of China would provide some resistance to these modern hordes, but the power of artillery would allow for these Soviet soldiers to destroy the old world for the sake of the new. However, the people of China would begin to doubt the intentions of their would-be liberators. In the modern day, when we look at a continent like Europe, each nation, for the most part, has their cultural peoples all within their national borders. Multicultural empires were not very prominent as compared to the desire for nationalism. There are many reasons why this may be the case, and are definitely worth studying. However, this is out of the scope of this video. The reason why I bring this up is that China is not like Europe. For a very long time, China has been a multicultural empire with a strong cultural center in the Han Chinese. However, Manchus, Mongols, Hui, Uyghur, and many other cultures called China home. Throughout its history, there hadn't been much need for special autonomous regions. However, the Leninist model of self-determination required there to be. You may already start to see this conflict of civilization manifest, but to put it simply, the Chinese communists may see the entirety of the region of China as China, and any attempts to give autonomy to the peoples who are not Han Chinese could be seen as a deliberate attempt to destroy China itself. A similar analog that I can see in this hypothetical case is a Soviet takeover of Quebec. Would the Soviets classify all of the former borders of Canada Canadian, or would the concept of a Canada be seen as an imperialist concept, and should therefore be divided amongst the communities that live in the region, and therefore destroy the national identity of Canada, period? I explore something like this in another video of mine, where I break down the lore of a Dead Hearts of Iron 4 mod, Kampf gegen Barbarei. Check it out in the top right. The question of whether or not China should remain whole or given several autonomies would leave the communist movement divided, with Trotsky and the Communist Party constantly delaying addressing the issue until after the war is won. Despite these ideological conflicts, the war raged on. While land acquisitions were initially significant, and the political victory of seizing Beijing in its entirety would be a great boon for their cause, the international support for the KMT would increase significantly, not only due to the Japanese incursion into Manchuria, but also due to the deployment of the US Marines in China. The United States of America would be incredibly alarmed by the spreading of communism to Germany. The advent of Trotsky's invasion in 1923 had given a significant blow to the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and his ideal of a League of Nations. Due to the political climate at home following the Great War, the USA did not join the League of Nations in our history, and I believe that in this timeline, this would also be the case. One of the ideals of the League of Nations was the disarmament of all nations for the sake of peace. The idea that the Americans would comply and encourage disarmament when communism was knocking on the doors of Western civilization would be absurd. Despite the concern of the entirety of Europe falling to communism, the average American did not wish to be conscripted to fight another European war. This isolationist sentiment of the public would be continuously attempted to be swayed by small and large business owners in America in order to protect their interests. This is simply because the economies of the capitalist nations of Europe suddenly became anti-trade, anti-private ownership. The free trade economy of the United States of America would be destroyed, and with it, the rise of socialism and communism in the country. It's for this exact reason why socialist and communist Americans would have been advocating for isolation. In order to prevent American imperialism from destroying the first workers' state, socialist unions and Trotskyists within the United States would partake in this war of ideas to sway the public towards true democracy, rather than continued subjugation to capitalist fat cats. With the Soviet invasion of China in 1927, the ideological debate between isolationism and workers' democracy versus intervening for the sake of liberty would be in full swing leading up to the 1928 elections. But even after the election would be settled in favor of Herbert Hoover, who had advocated for peace on the grounds of economic prosperity, there had to be some sort of reaction to the Soviet incursion into China. Right, strap in for an important political learning, kids. In order for the United States of America to formally declare war on a nation and conscript their citizens to fight for their country, there needs to be congressional approval. This stipulation is obviously to ensure that the democratic principles of the USA are protected. However, this model obviously cannot apply to the Navy, as they need to be operational at all times. Obviously, the Navy cannot perform any land actions, but because the US Marines are under the jurisdiction of the Navy, they can be deployed without congressional approval. This loophole is what allowed for the United States to act within their national interests without consulting the populace. The Marines of the United States were involved in direct military intervention in countries like Mexico, Haiti, and the Central American nations in order to keep their allies in power, or at least attempt to in the case of the Mexican Revolution. Regardless of the cynicism I personally have for the USA's foreign policy in this time period, the matter of fact is that the US Marines needed to be a very elite squad for this exact purpose. So when the USA hear news of the invasion of China by the Soviet Union, they would commit their garrison Marines to defend the Kuomintang. Oddly enough, they were already fighting without direction from their commander-in-chief, as Tianjin, the location of this Marines base, had become a frontline city in the Soviet invasion. Chief among the US Marines stationed in China was Smedley Butler. He would become the most decorated Marine in US history, but this fact is often foreshadowed by his controversial nature. The exact ways he was controversial are something we may end up exploring later. For now, all you need to know is that Smedley and his fellow Marines needed to defend themselves from the invading Soviet forces, indirectly involving the USA into this conflict. Many of Smedley's fellow Marines would be injured during these battles, himself included, and once news of the fighting Quaker and his fellow soldiers getting injured during the Soviets' invasion of China reached the public, their sympathy for limited or direct US participation in the defense of China significantly increased, much to the benefit of the anti-isolationists. Despite the increasing tensions and continued international support, the Soviets would manage to make further advances along the Yellow Sea. Eventually, the Soviet forces would end up clashing with the British concession of Weihawei. Despite Soviet orders not to invade the European treaty ports in fear of escalations, and in order to abide by the Treaty of Trier, the Chinese militias who fortified the ranks of the Red Army were eager to enact revenge on their imperialist oppressors. However, in their zeal, they may compromise the revolution in its entirety, as this direct military engagement between the Soviet-aligned armies and the British may put the threat of a second Great War beyond the point of no return. In our timeline, during the Northern Expedition, not exhibition, the Kuomintang had occupied British holdings in China. This was enough for the British to cut off diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, which caused the Soviet Union to be extremely worried of a British invasion. In this timeline, in 1928, the same scenario has occurred, but as a direct consequence of a Soviet invasion, not by one of their allies. The result of this point of divergence cannot be understated. With the Soviet incursion into British territories, the stationed armies in neighboring regions would begin to take more brazen actions, including direct support for the Xinjiang warlord bordering British India, and providing Tibet direct military support for occupying their contested regions, with the intention to advance the future Tibetan Soviet line further from the central region of Tibet and therefore British India. Not only this, but France, Italy, and all remaining nations that were included into the Stressafront had begun to mobilize for a direct conflict with the USSR. The moment of opportunity that the entirety of the class-conscious proletariat were waiting for seemed to be just beyond the horizon. The pro-war communist Germans were ecstatic for the future that they would be united with their countrymen. But their war of liberation would not come, as Trotsky would formally issue a diplomatic apology following the incursion into Weihawei. Trotsky's apologies made complete sense given the restrictions of the Treaty of Trier and the fact that the Soviets were busy focusing their war aims against the Chinese and could not afford a European war. However, the result of this apology would have permanently damaged Trotsky's reputation. To the Germans and Chinese, he promised them liberation. Now, Trotsky seems to simply be collaborating with the British and their imperial spheres of influence. Anti-Trotsky sentiment began to rise to unprecedented levels, destabilizing the Soviet Union and compromising the war effort. After weakness was observed by the Japanese, they had begun to march into Russian territory, beginning to besiege the city of Vladivostok, the most vital Pacific port of the Soviet Union. The advance of the Soviet zones of China would be halted as the Red Army would need to begin to push the Japanese out of Manchuria. The Korean communists, who were eagerly awaiting their orders to rise up, had begun their organized partisan activity, and a breakthrough along the Yellow Sea had forced the Japanese to retreat to Port Arthur. As the Red Army was about to invade Korea proper, the invasion was called off. As the leader of the invasion, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was found murdered in his quarters. Mikhail Tukhachevsky's death was a very calculated move made by the British intelligence agency. The goals of the assassination were to impede the invasion's progress in China and secure Japan's ability to properly respond to the shifted direction, but also to instill significant doubt and instability in the Soviet Union itself. While many within the Soviet Union could tell easily that this was a foreign plot, Trotsky would be convinced that this was an inside job, thanks to the misinformation planted by the British agent. As mentioned before, Trotsky had few allies in his government due to his ideological rigidity and lack of a Stalin Constitution-esque document to ensure his power within the state. While Trotsky may have had an ally in the GSCP, that being the Trotskyite Karl Radek, the members of the former Stalin triumvirate of Kamenev and Zinoviev could not be trusted. Trotsky would be fully aware of their decision to betray Stalin in order to take his place in the division of power, and there's no doubt that if given the chance, they would replace Trotsky as well. In order to best secure his position, Trotsky had begun a series of purges within the party. Trotsky's actions towards his opposition would cause significant unrest in the Western Union republics. While the Trotskyite 5-year plan was incredibly well envisioned, much like the industrialization under Stalin in our history, this incredible rush to industrialization and the sudden pivot away from civilian consumer goods for the benefit of the army had come at an extreme cost of lives. In our timeline, there was a devastating famine in the Soviet Union, mostly centered in the Ukrainian SSR. This is a very controversial issue with many different points of view, but the consensus in the Western world is usually that this was at the very least a natural famine which was exacerbated by the collectivization measures being enacted at the time. Many communists within the USSR had sought to eliminate the wealthy farmers of the Ukraine, the kulaks, peasant farmers who had managed to purchase land from the Tsarist Russian nobility. Ideologically, despite their farming expertise, they were still landowners, and were therefore against the basic tenets of a classless communist society that they had all strived for. Thus, the Bolsheviks had taken measures to seize the lands that the kulaks had owned, and either folded them into the new collectivized, state-owned farms, or, if they refused, sent them to work camps in Siberia and proceeded with the collectivization without them. In our history, the USSR had only controlled a portion of Ukraine. However, in this timeline, the USSR was in control of the entire former imperial region besides Bessarabia. The breadbasket of Europe was completely under the control of the USSR, and the industrial advancements of mechanized farming being at the disposal of the Soviets, thanks to their occupation of Germany, would surely have prevented this famine, right? Unfortunately, I predict that it would be worse. Far, far worse. Trotsky in this alternate timeline will adopt the same position as our history, that the peasants would be enemies of the socialist revolution. Trotsky would consider all peasantry as inherently antagonistic to the USSR and would therefore take harsher measures than in our timeline, if that's even conceivable. Not only this, but the collectivization measures would involve the governmental seizure of grain and other important natural resources to supply their invasion of China, further exacerbating the problem. The Polish would be in a similar situation as well, further contributing to the loss of life. As the effects of collectivization and industrialization become apparent to the party, there were many who would begin to criticize the collectivization efforts of Trotsky, just like they had to Stalin in our history. These opponents, Bukharin, Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky, would be known as the right opposition. In our timeline, there were three blocks within the Communist Party: the center under Stalin, the right under Bukharin, and the left under Trotsky. Trotsky's political leanings as compared to Stalin have already been discussed, and we'll get into more details as needed, so for now we'll only focus on the right opposition. The right had advocated for a gradual industrialization of the Soviet Union through the use of the new economic policy, which allowed for limited forms of capitalism but with strict oversight by the Bolsheviks, while others in the left had advocated for a far more hasty, forced industrialization process. The right opposition was generally at odds with any sort of forced collectivization measures, instead opting to influence economic conditions towards their eventual abolition. In our timeline, Stalin would have initially ostracized the left opposition, before adopting their view in industrialization, and therefore antagonizing the right opposition. This had led to the rise of the united opposition, uniting the left and right against Stalin. This united opposition was eventually eliminated by Stalin until only those that aligned with him had remained. However, Trotsky's position in the party was extremely different than Stalin's. Stalin had managed to make necessary political advances, only turning on potential fifth columns when it was safe to do so, which eventually led to his uncontested control over the USSR. Trotsky was a strict ideologue, and therefore the dynamic of a right, center, and left faction within the party would not manifest in the same way. While it's extremely difficult to predict the ideological alignment of several dozen influential figures in the Soviet Union and attempting to consider the material conditions of the Soviet Union, I believe that the right would be the only main source of opposition to Trotsky, and the center, without a leader, would sway either to Trotsky or Bukharin's faction depending on the success of Trotsky. Bukharin, despite his clear positioning against Trotsky and his theories, would not be able to be purged due to the lack of a proper precedent. However, since the Soviet Union was at war, Trotsky would be able to accuse Bukharin and his supporters of attempting to create a fifth column, collaborating with the kulaks and other dissident groups in order to destroy the USSR, expelling prominent members of the right opposition from the party, and imprisoning many notable figures on the grounds of treason. With this sudden, direct attack against the previously united party, a period of significant instability would take place, manifesting in different ways amongst the Union republics. Due to the dissatisfaction with the war's progression, the Ukrainian, Polish, Belarusian, and German Union republics would demand that Trotsky sign a form of peace in order to prevent the Soviet Union from becoming overextended. Their hope was that if the Soviet Union was at peace, they could hard pivot away from spreading communism through war and instead focus on tending to the citizens of the Union who had become increasingly more dissatisfied with their governments. Lenin had established the USSR and designed its governmental structure with the ideal of collective leadership in mind. In order to achieve this, each Union republic had a seat in government, and therefore a voice in how the Union was to be run. Lenin had attempted to adhere to this principle by ensuring that the highest legal authority of the Soviet Union was the Congress of Soviets. While it would have been ideal for this Congress to be always active, the Soviet Union was so vast that these congresses would only occur once every year or so. With the spread of defeatism among the European Union republics, it was clear to Trotsky and all the remaining pro-war Union republics that they had to pack the court before the next Congress would be called in order to keep the war going, and not leave the Chinese proletariat subjugated to foreign capital. Using the reason that every citizen of the Union, including occupied territories, needs a vote in the struggle for the liberation of their comrades, Trotsky integrated the East Turkestani, Mongolian, and recently invented Manchurian Republic into the USSR as Union republics. While some would see Trotsky's actions as beneficial to the cause of adhering to Lenin's principles by granting these republics a say, this unfortunately would antagonize many Chinese communists, as they would doubt the intentions of Trotsky. We'll explore exactly how this fracturing would impact the communist movement in China next episode. But for now, we must turn our attention to the Baltics, as the Stresephant has begun influencing their politics. When the Russian Civil War had spilled into the Baltic states, the Bolsheviks had attempted to spread the revolution to these nations. However, each had repelled the Soviet advance. The result was that each of these three nations were eventually recognized as independent nations, which would enjoy a friendship with the RSFSR, which would eventually become the Soviet Union. While many may think that this peace deal would not be particularly advantageous to the Baltic states, these peace deals would be extremely important for the international recognition of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as up until that point, they had not been recognized by any major power, allowing for themselves to gain significant legitimacy and recognition from the other major powers of the world. While this peace may have been advantageous in 1920, it's now 1929, and the geopolitical situation has shifted immensely. The status quo of pro-Soviet neutrality was now being questioned by the Baltic states, as the communist and nationalist political organizations would be fighting for dominance in regional politics. The Stresa Front would be seeking to cut off the Soviets' direct land access to the North German SSR, and while Czechoslovakia was a very promising staging point, Lithuania was also extremely vital. Nestled squarely between the German, Polish, and Belarusian Union republics, any Stresa-aligned troops positioned there would provide a significant advantage to any Stresan advance into Poland. With the delicate political environment within the Soviet Union, the Baltic countries had the confidence to start acting against the communist parties within their state, a move which directly challenged Soviet authority and violated the terms of their pro-Soviet neutrality. Fearing the potential direct advance of the Stresa Front, Trotsky had instructed the Baltic communist cells to execute their planned insurgency activities against the governments within, without consulting the military beforehand. Wise to Trotsky's tricks, the Baltic states would put down the communist revolutionaries and expel them outside their nation's borders. The would-be communist leaders of the Baltic countries would be exiled into the Kremlin, where they would urge Trotsky to invade. As more Union republics would become skeptical of Trotsky's direction, any additions of Union republics into the USSR was incredibly important for him to keep his firm grip on the nation. Thus, Trotsky would instruct the military, who had been stalling in Asia, to be redeployed to Europe, where they would plan a retaliatory invasion of the Baltic states. Panicking, the Baltic states had reached out to the Stresa Front, who had immediately begun mobilizing to prepare for a direct military conflict with the Soviet Union. It's an alternate 1930, and the war between the workers and the oppressors seems inevitable. This timeline diverged from our history in 1922, where the leader of the German army, Hans von Seht, had agreed to a partitioning of Poland with the USSR. This deal, orchestrated by Trotsky, had enabled him to coordinate with the Hamburg Uprising, allowing for the USSR to gain control over northern Germany in 1924. With such a momentous victory for the workers' revolution, Trotsky would become leader of the Soviet Union following Lenin's death. Only 3 years later, the Soviet Union had begun an invasion of China. What was supposed to be a quick liberation of the workers there had turned into an elongated conflict. The remaining capitalist nations of the world had all banded together to support the Kuomintang under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, who had, at the behest of the pro-Japanese faction of the KMT, signed a treaty with Japan which brought them into the conflict. The Soviets had prepared for a potential Japanese intervention, and began a strike on Korea in order to liberate the colonial subjects of the Japanese from imperialism. But the advance had stalled after a British agent had assassinated Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Unaware of Britain's involvement in the assassination, Trotsky had started becoming increasingly paranoid of an internal conspiracy against his rule. Due to his ideological rigidity and focus on war before communism can be achieved, the internal structure of the Soviet Union remained dysfunctional, and any attempts for Trotsky to consolidate his rule would be met with resistance from the growing factionalism within the party. Despite the internal chaos that may follow, he had begun a purge of the party, starting with imprisoning the opposition, who in our timeline was the right opposition, and has begun investigating the army and party members for defeatist sentiments. These purges, as well as the lack of progress in the Chinese invasion, alienated the leaders of the Union republics against him. As leader of the Soviet Union, he was expected to follow the ideal of collective leadership, so the threat of the Union republic's leadership turning against him could spell his demise. Thus, Trotsky began to pack the court by inviting the Manchurian, Mongolian, and East Turkestanis into the Soviet Union as Union Republics, increasing the amount of Union Republics in favor of continuing the war in China, but alienating a substantial amount of Chinese communists. In response to this perceived weakness, the Stresa Front had begun reaching out to the Baltic states, who had managed to preserve their independence, and invited them into the Stresa Front. News of these developments had reached Trotsky, and thus ordered the communist cells within these states to revolt. After these revolutions failed, he reassigned several divisions committed to the Chinese advance back to Europe in order to invade the Baltics before the Stresa Front could send troops to fortify their position. Soviet troops had managed to advance on all sides of the Baltic states, but their primary focus would be to seize Riga. If successful, the Soviets would manage to cut off the Lithuanian and Estonian states, preventing them from connecting up to each other. While the situation was dire, Strese's support was theoretically en route to the Baltic states. The Soviet Union was now officially at war with the Baltics, allowing for them to attack any Stresen-aligned shipments of soldiers or equipment. Would the Baltic states survive this onslaught of the Soviet Union? Was the Stresa Front actually capable of supporting the Baltic states? Or were their guarantees just talk? And are the Soviets really prepared for such a large-scale conflict? The Stresa Front was barely keeping itself whole for the last decade. Territorial disputes between the fashionable nations of the front constantly clashed with the cordon sanitaire of the French, but despite the tensions, they could not afford to shatter themselves. The Treaty of Trier had ensured that these nations could potentially recover their economies, but by doing so, they had allowed for communist cells within their nations to fester. The once superlegal policies of supporting paramilitary organizations became official national security policy following the Soviet incursion into the Baltics. The British fashionistas and the French national leagues were now being contracted by their governments in order to use their expertise to preserve their national integrity, despite their criminal activity. These actions of the democracies to flirt with fashion had emboldened Trotsky's resolve. If the Stresa Front decided to resist the Soviet Union, the industrial proletariat of these nations would succeed in their revolutions. The workers of the world would be united, and the world that Marx had envisioned would be in their grasp. But despite the actions Trotsky had taken to make sure that there was no internal threats to the workers' revolution, many party members, leaders of the Union Republics, and members of the military would doubt Trotsky's aggressive foreign policy. When the British had broken off diplomatic ties to the Soviet Union after Wei Hao-wei was attacked by the Kuomintang in our timeline, there was a significant panic within the ranks of the Soviet military, as they feared that they were grossly unprepared for a proper conflict. In this timeline, the Soviets would be far better off, as they would have German industry and military surplus to help supply their army. However, a large portion of these military resources could have been designated for a war in China, mitigating the benefit. Another risk to this aggressive approach was that the western bulwark of the Bolshevik Revolution, the North German Soviet Socialist Republic, had increasingly worrying signs of disobedience and non-compliance with Trotsky's regime. For half a decade, the North German Soviet Socialist Republic and their citizens would grow increasingly dissatisfied with Trotsky's leadership. While initially enthusiastic of his rule, skepticism had begun to grow. His invasion of China, apologies to Britain, and hostility towards the Baltics had caused the average German proletarian to believe that they may have been deceived by his promises. Instead of subscribing to the Bolshevik Party, many workers had begun to vote for independent parties. Most of these independents would be former members of the Communist Party of Germany, who were expelled following Lenin's denunciation of National Bolshevism. The most prominent of these black sheep was Heinrich Laufenberg, the progenitor of the ideology itself. In our timeline, Heinrich's ideas of marrying the German nation and the proletariat to expel the Entente from Germany with the help of the Soviet Union would cause him ridicule. However, after the Soviet Union had supported the Hamburg Uprising in this timeline, of which he was a participant, Northern Germany was introduced into the Soviet Union as a Union Republic. Despite his continued loyalty to the Communist Revolution and active participation in the spreading of the revolution to Germany, he would be expelled from the Communist Party after the KPD would be assimilated into the Bolshevik Party, leaving him partyless. In our timeline, Laufenberg would be a founding member of a splinter party of the KPD, the KAPD. But as he was a citizen of the North German Soviet Socialist Republic, the only legal party of the Soviet Union was the Bolshevik Party. Any sort of attempt to organize a rival party would be seen as treasonous. Instead, I believe Laufenberg and many other ideological black sheep would attempt to be elected as independents within the Soviet Union. As more and more German proletarians would be disillusioned with the direction of Trotsky, more and more independents would be elected, including Laufenberg, who would become a form of alternative left leader as compared to other independents who may be more focused on local issues. Due to Trotsky's purges against the right opposition, there was a significant vacuum of power within the NGSSR. By purging those who opposed him, he had alienated nearly every remaining official supporter of his regime in Germany. If this had continued, it's possible that North Germany itself would find a way to break free from the Soviet Union, either by violent revolution or a vote of secession. A concession had to be made. In order to regain the German proletariat's cooperation in this coming class struggle, Trotsky would reverse the Lenin-era decision to expel Heinrich Laufenberg and others who sympathized with the National Bolshevik theory and reintroduce them to the party, conditional to their repentance for their heresy. But why would Trotsky ever do this? Isn't this contradictory to his purges? And why would Trotsky ever accept anybody who had even a lick of nationalism in their ideology? Before we continue, I want to make something extremely clear. Laufenberg's National Bolshevism in this period of history is not like the National Bolshevism of our time period. Laufenberg's ideology is more like a Maoistic view on the role of the petite bourgeoisie's role in the workers' revolution, rather than rebranded German fashion. While Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin had all been adamant that the petite bourgeoisie were enemies of the revolution, Mao was unique in that he considered them to be a force for good so long as they worked together with the Communist Party. Even the flag of the People's Republic of China references the four classes of the peasants, the intelligentsia, workers, and petite bourgeois all working together under the guidance of the Communist Party of China. To put it simply, Laufenberg and Trotsky have more in common as left communist sympathizers rather than Bukharin, who, to left comms, lacked the vision needed in order to achieve a communist society, still clinging on to the modes of production of the past. And while Laufenberg had displayed some form of sympathy for nationalists, the denunciation of his former ideology would cause him and his closer followers to begin associating with Trotsky's Bolsheviks. With this move, Trotsky has been able to continue to ensure the loyalty of the NGSSR, which had been continuously resisting his rule. Future elections would slowly introduce a new generation of communists loyal to his vision in Germany and the true bulwark of Bolshevism against the West. However, by taking this action, Trotsky has given National Bolshevism a signal boost. Regardless of Laufenberg's denunciation of his former ideology, many of his followers continue to practice other heretical thoughts and implement them into their policies, while others who may have associated with Laufenberg as a prophet of a new form of ideology would look to his kowtow Trotsky as an ultimate betrayal, passing the torch of his ideological development to new thinkers. Regardless of this ideological degradation, Trotsky would have gotten what he needed out of Germany at this point: loyalty. And once Germany was truly unified, the usefulness of these heretical thinkers would dry up and could be easily cleansed with another purge. Unfortunately for Trotsky, this trick couldn't work everywhere. In Poland, Ukraine, and many other Union republics, dissatisfaction was growing immensely. The idea that the Soviet Union would be risking a direct conflict with the Stresa Front while they were still stalling in Asia was incredibly risky, and only ensured their vulnerability. And sure enough, the decision to move troops away from Asia was exploited by the Sino-Japanese alliance. Ever since the introduction of the East Turkestani, Mongolian, and Manchurian Union republics in the Soviet Union, the Chinese communists faced a schism that would tear the movement apart. Many members within the CCP had assumed that when Trotsky said he was going to liberate China under communism, that it meant that the Chinese nations and its borders would be respected. Instead, the Soviet Union integrated several minority groups into their region, who had previously been loyal subjects of the Chinese nation. While Trotsky may have been an ideologue, he would also understand that there would need to be some concessions made during a transitional period away from the nation-states of the past. Thus, he had proposed a solution to the Chinese communists. Once the Communist Revolution was successfully spread to China, the Union Republics of East Turkestan, Mongolia, and Manchuria would become Union Republics as a Chinese Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. This compromise of offering the Chinese SFSR status, rather than being carelessly divided among ethnic lines, would appease some members of the CCP, but would also lead to the remainder to feel betrayed by Trotsky. The communists within the CCP who would distrust Trotsky's motives and rejected the compromise, I believe, would be led by Li Dazhao. Li Dazhao was an early Chinese communist, but was not a strict follower of Trotsky. In some cases in his writing, he had expressed some form of exceptionalism, claiming that the Chinese nation had a special role in the global revolutionary struggle. With this and other phrases in mind, I'm going to say that I believe that Li Dazhao would form the primary anti-Trotsky communist movement, even going so far as to defect towards a united front with the Kuomintang. At least through their collaboration against the Soviet Union, China could be whole again. With this betrayal of the revolution, several Soviet zones would either face desertions, negotiated surrenders, or retreats back to the underground, waiting for another opportunity for a true Chinese Communist revolution, rather than allowing China to, once again, be subjugated by Europeans. Needless to say, this would be a catastrophic development for the Asian War. With the Soviet army reassigning many Asian divisions to Europe for the Baltic advance, the Kuomintang would be able to forcibly eliminate the Soviet zones still loyal to Trotsky, and began organizing the completion of the Northern Expedition with help of the Japanese. Now, even the newly introduced Union Republics would begin to question Trotsky's leadership. In order to gain more support for this war, Trotsky would turn to Central Asia in order to establish more Union Republics. However, this region too would be unstable, and even more so due to the divergences. During the Lenin era of the Soviet Union, there were two Central Asian Union Republics, and the remaining Union Republics that we consider today would only be elevated later. Beforehand, these regions would be administered by the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic as autonomous republics. These autonomies would be able to represent themselves and begin to foster their identities separate from the Russians. But to many, it was not enough. They wanted full independence. During the Russian Civil War and far beyond, these people would organize into a paramilitary known as the Basmachi and would perform several raids against the Soviets. Eventually, these bandits would be expelled into Afghanistan, where they would organize in secret, waiting to strike again. However, due to a regime change, they would become directly aligned with the new government and would begin attacking Soviet holdings in Central Asia by 1928. In order to prevent further raids and properly stabilize Central Asia, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1929. Unlike the invasion in 1989, the primary objective of the advance was not to prop up a socialist republic. Instead, the Soviets had wished to reinstall the former king of Afghanistan, Amrullah Khan, ousting the emir Habibullah Kalakani. In our timeline, this conflict would resolve pretty quickly. The modernized Red Army, supported with airplanes, would be able to rout the ill-prepared insurgents. However, in this timeline, the Soviet Union could not afford to commit a large force to Afghanistan. The Soviet Air Force would be more focused on using their advantage against the Chinese, or supporting the ongoing Baltic invasion. Despite these setbacks, I predict that the Soviet army would still manage to perform well against the Basmachi in the Emirate of Afghanistan in open conflict. However, the British would be directly supporting the Emirate against the Soviet Union. While the Emirates' support of Islamic fundamentalist insurgents could spell trouble for the British Raj in the future, they were absolutely the lesser of two evils. It would also be extremely obvious to the British that the Soviets were attempting to establish a land connection between themselves and the British Raj. Many Soviet officials believed that if the Soviets were able to reach India and support an anti-imperialist revolt, the British economy would collapse, subsequently leading to a British Revolution. It is for this reason that the British had begun supporting the Xinjiang warlord and Tibet. Now, they would support the Emirate of Afghanistan as well. The Great Game has finally reached its climax. Britain has supported any and all nations that are positioned between the Russians and the crown jewel of their empire. And now, the British would make their official response to the Soviet incursions into the Baltics. They and the rest of the Stresa Front would resist the Soviets' invasion attempts through an armed conflict. The Second World War had begun. moment has finally come. For too long, the imperialists have been allowed to lick their wounds and adjust their imperial aims to prop up the rotting corpse of capitalism. The Social Democrats become social fashionistas in attempts to reform their way to liberation, while the more honest fashionistas crush them outright with a boot. The seeds of revolution that Lenin had planted in Russia have blossomed into a true socialist nation, but it's not enough. The industrial proletariat of Europe yearns for liberation, and we hear you. The soldiers of the Soviet Union will heed your call and liberate you from your oppressors. It is time for the workers of the world to unite. With these words, Trotsky had triggered each dormant communist cell that had been laid in the nation's Strasser Front, and even beyond. While the advance into China, with its agrarian population, may not have been as fruitful as Trotsky had hoped, there was no doubt in Trotsky's mind. The European proletariat would pull through. While the Strasser Front began their advances into the Soviet Union, several industries would begin to strike, compromising their supply. The shipments of Streltsyn troops to the Baltic states would be engaged in the Baltic Sea by the Soviet Navy, preventing their landings in the states themselves, as they get subjugated by the Soviet Union, mitigating but not eliminating the threat of encirclement of the NGSSR. The Streltsyn navies would do their best to give refuge to the former Baltic governments and any loyal soldiers before evacuating back to the British Isles. While it's a sound plan, the Soviets had their own advantage. The Treaty of Trier had allowed for the Soviet Union to ensure that the governments of Britain, France, and other democratic nations whom they had previously been fighting with were unable to suppress the communist movements in their countries, allowing for them to grow. In an attempt to circumvent this, the British and French had taken a page out of Italy's book, covertly and now overtly supporting paramilitary fashionistas to dissuade the proletariat from organizing in their states. The governmental sponsorship of terrorism against their own country's workers would destabilize these countries, granting the communists within Britain and France a perfect opportunity to rise up and partake in the workers' war. While local law enforcement have been managing to mitigate the effect of the instability of their nations, currently not needing any support from the military, there are several other nations in Europe who would be significantly impacted by Trotsky's Emancipation Proclamation. But would these communist organizations make enough of a difference in the main conflict? And will the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian exiles manage to reach friendly land? The timing of this declaration of war by Trotsky could not have come at a better time. In our history, in 1929, the American stock market crashed. While many economic factors contributed to the Great Depression, Black Thursday is designated as its beginning. The Great Depression is a very complicated topic, and since I'm not an economist and only a hobbyist historian, I cannot in good faith make any blanket statements about this crisis, only my educated opinion. Instead of me attempting to give a major history lesson, I'll instead focus on the point of divergence and how the subsequent effects could influence the severity of the crisis. Given the fact that not much would have changed leading up to the Great Depression beforehand, while at the same time adding on the factors of a lack of a German economy in the world economy, any reparations coming to France or Britain, the loans that America would be loaning Germany wouldn't happen, the increased presence of leftist movements, and the conflicts in China, it's probable that the Great Depression would be much worse. However, war is good for business. While the USA was not directly involved in the conflict, the arms manufacturers of the nation would see increased profits as they sell their goods overseas to fight against the Soviets. So the US economy may be still doing well leading up to Black Thursday. However, there's the political scenario to consider. The government at the time of the Great Depression was the isolationist Herbert Hoover. There's something to be said about a Soviet scare causing his opponent in the election to be elected instead. However, I decided to go with Hoover anyway, as I believe that the American public would be in favor of isolationism after losing so many of their friends and loved ones to a war overseas, even if the battle overseas was against the arch nemesis of free trade capitalism. In fact, the isolationist sentiment may even play to the sympathy that the workers have for Trotskyism. Due to the divergences, a larger amount of working class people's incomes would be reduced. Therefore, the sympathy of socialism in America may be far larger than our history. However, Trotsky's foreign policy and actions towards the German National Bolsheviks may alienate a large portion of these people, effectively neutralizing the radicalism of the movement, while still having a significant effect over the political landscape. When the people would demand intervention in the economy and that it be considered something that the government shouldn't do because the government should be small, there's no doubt in my mind that many would seek to desire a larger government. This is what led to the rise of the popularity of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in our timeline, who, during his campaign, promised a New Deal that would use the strength of the federal government to provide work for the unemployed, as well as many other programs which would help end the Great Depression. While FDR's leadership is certainly a guarantee in this alternate history scenario given the circumstances, Herbert Hoover was still in charge of the United States. Given his policies, cabinet, and ideology, there's little to no possibility that the tariffs which restricted the economic potential of the United States, as well as the rest of the world, would lift, even if it would have helped fix the economy or strengthen the capitalist nations fighting the Soviet Union. Instead, America would provide aid to the Stressor Front, but only through private trade deals, increased debt, and more. This may be a detrimental policy to enact. However, I believe that American capitalists would be far more concerned about a revolution at home causing their assets or their lives to end, rather than the good of the rest of the world. Maybe if a major European power were to come to crisis, there would be more of a precedent for Herbert Hoover and the United States of America to change their policy. But for now, America would continue to be the shining city on a hill, while the rest of the world suffered the wrath of the Soviet Union. The lack of American belligerence in the war was a boon to the Soviet Union. But if the American elections had turned out in favor of the Democrats, the United States of America changing their policy to active participation against the Soviet Union was possible, even without a declaration of war. Trotsky and their high command knew that they only had a short window of time to deal a decisive blow to the capitalist world. They thought that China would have been enough, but it was clear that an industrial power like France or Britain had to fall. To this end, the Soviets would push into the French satellite states of the Rhine and Baden-Württemberg, hoping to quickly unite Germany before blitzing to Paris. The Soviets would easily push the French and Rhinish out of the Ruhr, as the local workers' organizations had nearly immediately defected to the Soviet Union following the Emancipation Proclamation. But the flimsier of the two satellite states, Baden-Württemberg, had survived thanks to the fortifications in Frankfurt. After the French had stopped supporting the Weimar Republic, they had hastily supported the former administrative regions of Baden-Württemberg and their neighboring minor regions under a single state. While the Rhinish separatist movement had some precedent, as they were a Catholic minority region in an oversized Protestant state of Prussia, the regional dialects of Baden and Württemberg were split between the Alemannian and Swabian. While each had their own minor nationalist movements, they were absolutely not represented in the way that they should have been. This would manifest as armed resistance in favor of the Soviet Union, which constituted a heavy presence of French forces in the region, and therefore fortifications. The delicate political structure in Baden-Württemberg would be noted by the Soviet Union, and would therefore be prioritized in their capitulation. But despite repeated efforts to break the French in their fortifications, they held on. This left the Soviets needing to consider alternative approaches. The most obvious decision would be to try their luck invading Bavaria to circumvent the Frankfurt fortifications. The government was a Republican, social democratic one, which had risen after Mustache Man had seized control of the state during the brief German warlord period. Thus, there was a cornucopia of ideologies that existed within the state. No thanks to the secret services of both the Stressor Front and Comintern working to organize democratic or forcible changes of power to a government that would align to their cause. The Soviets and French both would gain significantly from Bavaria flipping to their side. For now, there were too many other problems for the French and the Soviets to handle. So instead, Bavaria would remain tentatively neutral. We'll explore the fate of Bavaria, especially highlighting the unique ideological cocktail that has been brewing in Franconia. But for now, we must focus on the measures that the Soviets have taken in attempts to destabilize the Stressor Front. Trotsky's Emancipation Proclamation had brought many industries in France and Britain to a complete halt. The previously localized clashes with government-aligned fashionistas, law enforcement, and workers' organizations would spread to larger areas. However, none of them had managed to organize large enough to be considered a separate faction, fighting to overthrow the government in a civil war. The exception to this rule would actually manifest in a neutral country, Spain. Spain had remained a neutral power during the First World War, but had still faced political and economic instability due to their dependence on other nations' resources and trade. In 1923, a Spanish general, Miguel Primo de Rivera, had performed a coup and became a dictator. This dictatorship, with a monarchy in collaboration and a deliberate attempt to accommodate Spanish corporations within government, mimicked the efforts of Yes Man and his Italian fashionistas, and the two nations enjoyed good relations. In our history, after Spain's economic instability, the support of de Rivera's dictatorship had declined. Thus, the monarch, Alfonso XIII of Spain, had dismissed him, and once elections were properly reintroduced, the popular support of the monarchy was so low that Alfonso had decided to peacefully abdicate, thus creating the Second Republic. Due to the divergences, I don't feel like Alfonso or Miguel would act in the same way. Trotsky's ideology, even pre-proclamation, was clearly pro-war and revolutionary. Rather than attempting to keep the peace by changing prime ministers and abdicating, I feel that the anti-socialists of Spain would rally under the monarch, rather than siding with Republicans. This would force the Spanish socialists and communists to band together into a united front and revolt against the Spanish monarchy, causing the Spanish conservatives and reactionaries to fully adopt fashion, giving a rise to a new style in Europe, Spanish fashion. The Spanish monarchy would quickly seek aid from the Stresa Front, who would accept them with open arms. As if the communist movement were to take over Spain, France would now be facing a two-front war with the Comintern, which would be a terrifying prospect considering the tenuous front line in Germany. After the Baltic states had fallen to Soviet occupation, the Streltsyn Navy in the Baltic was in a perfect position to escort the now exiled governments and soldiers out from the hostile seas, leading them back to Western Europe to support the liberation of Soviet Europe. The Soviet Union would be aware of the fleeing Baltic nations' governments and soldiers. If they allowed the British Navy to escape from the Baltic Sea, the resistance that they would face in these states would be a severe pain for Soviet logistics. This is even why the Bolsheviks had withdrawn from the Baltics in 1920, as the guerrilla warfare that these Baltic nations had enacted was especially effective. Since the Kiel Canal was in control of the Soviet Union, the only way that the Streltsyn navies could either enter or leave the Baltic Sea was through the Danish Straits. The British had managed to use the Danish Straits as they were neutral. However, the Soviets would accuse the Danish of directly collaborating with the Stresa Front by allowing their passage, nullifying their neutrality. Trotsky would issue an ultimatum. If they wished to continue to exist, they must deny the Streltsyn Navy's ability to escape from the Baltic Sea. The Danish would refuse, and therefore, the Soviet Union would begin an invasion of Denmark, quickly seizing Jutland. Yet another attack that highlights the aggressive tendencies of the Soviet Union, and with great effect. Now that Denmark was involved in the conflict, the British Navy could openly position themselves in Denmark and plan an invasion, but the seizure of the Jutlandic Peninsula would allow for the airfields and dockyards of the peninsula to potentially deny that possibility. If this gamble succeeded, the Soviets may be able to eliminate the threat of the British Navy in their liberation of the workers, an undeniable boon for their cause. But this decision by Trotsky was, once again, not done with the approval of either the military or the navy, further straining their relationship and Trotsky's rule. My predictions of Trotsky's foreign policy always leads back to the aggressive behavior that had granted him success in the past. Trotsky's decision to constantly focus on aggression without considering options which would encourage him to hold himself back would be rooted in the belief that if they had listened to the people who would have advocated for socialism in one country, they would have allowed for the Soviet Union to stagnate and would never achieve communism. Therefore, he would accuse any who would be encouraging moderation as a member of the Stalin clique, and would therefore be purged, much like Trotsky would purge Stalin, as he would order his assassination. Stalin would have gone into exile, much like Trotsky had in our timeline. While I'm not sure where Stalin would have eventually ended up in this period of time in history, I feel like it wouldn't be really important to know, because Trotsky would give Stalin the same treatment as our history: overt assassination, regardless of where he was in the world. With the public murder of Trotsky's greatest political foe and the previously enacted purges, the military would comply with Trotsky's directives, leaving Trotsky completely ignorant of an anti-war faction who would begin to plot in the background as they investigated potential weaknesses of his regime. The anti-war faction would grow, especially after the Eastern Front began to falter. The young Union republics of East Turkestan, Mongolia, and Manchuria had all been slowly occupied by Kuomintang, supported by the Japanese, and the Basmachi would become more and more confident in their operations. the lowered Soviet garrisons of Central Asia would begin retreating away from the Central Asian Union Republic's territories, and insurgents in Tajikistan would manage to gain control of the Union Republic's territory, claiming independence from the Soviet Union. These losses in the Asia theater would be slightly alarming, but as long as a major breakthrough was made in the European front, it would all be worth it. The British fleet being caught up in the Baltic Sea would be a major boon for Trotsky's legitimacy, but the lack of meaningful progress in Germany would alarm many officials. However, Trotsky still had another card he could play. Unknowingly to him, he would use the same trick that the British had used on him, with the goal of shattering the foundations of the Stresa front. Yugoslavia had faced a significant period of instability in 1930. After a Serbian politician had opened fire on a prominent Croatian politician, while parliament was still in session, the king had abolished the constitution and embraced a royal dictatorship. During a period of transition and stabilization, a new constitution was penned, and the kingdom was renamed to Yugoslavia. Following these reforms, the king had abolished the dictatorship, allowing for the democratic process to begin again in the new state. Unfortunately for the Yugoslavians, the Soviet Union had declared war on the Stresa front before the king could step down from his dictatorship. In order to best lead his country during this chaos, the Yugoslavian king would extend the dictatorship until the war with the Soviet Union was completed. With the temporary dictatorship now becoming indefinitely permanent, national separatists and communist revolutionaries had begun taking action against the state. In our timeline, the king of Yugoslavia would be assassinated by Croatian separatists on October 9th, 1934. I believe that in this timeline, the assassination would occur far earlier. The Soviet Union would covertly assassinate the king in order to destabilize Yugoslavia and coax Italy into a situation that would threaten the very foundations of the Stresa front. While Italy has been desperately waiting for an incident in Yugoslavia as a means to expand their influence, the timing of this death would be extremely problematic. Despite their mutually hostile territorial claims, the Yugoslavians had chosen to fight alongside the Italians against the greater threat. Now what will Italy do? Do they pass up on this opportunity to expand their influence in the Balkans to ensure victory against communism? Or would they cannibalize their ally for the sake of minor territorial gains? Well, of course they would do the second one. They're fashionistas after all. Citing the instability of the region and the potential of communist Yugoslavians taking advantage of the chaos to create a Soviet-aligned state, the Italians would march into Yugoslavian territory with the intent to reorganize the state. France would be outraged at the decision of the Italians to occupy Yugoslavia without consulting them first. In order to attempt to not be seen as directly cannibalizing their ally, Italy would call for an emergency conference in order to establish a new order in Yugoslavia. The instability in Yugoslavia had disrupted the Italian and French presence within Romania, which had enabled them to begin a large-scale operation against Romania, with the aim to occupy the Palesi oil fields. While the Soviets were not in any desperate need of oil thanks to the Baku oil fields, their primary objective would be to deny the Stresa front their primary supply of oil. Will the Stresa front survive the Yugoslavian crisis? Will the Soviets manage to capitalize on the Yugoslavian chaos in time to take control over Romania? Will a victory in Romania be enough to satiate the anti-war conspirators within the Soviet Union? What has been happening in Bavaria this whole time? And who will they side with in this conflict? The brazen move by Italy to occupy Yugoslavia for peacekeeping was extremely controversial and inflammatory. However, the risk was an extremely well-calculated one. There was enough of a precedent for this action to be justified, granting Italy a serious diplomatic edge. While the most apparent decision for France would be to stubbornly hold the independence of their ally, Yugoslavia, there would be serious consequences if they had. Italy was occupying Yugoslavia, and therefore determining whether or not French supplies would be able to reach Romania or Czechoslovakia. If they weren't able to connect with them, they would be unable to survive against the Soviet onslaught. Italy would be aware of this possibility, and thus would begin gesturing to the Soviet Union that they would be willing to sign a peace with them in exchange for keeping their sphere of influence intact. This deal would be amazing for the Soviet Union, and would mimic the sort of foreign policy they had undertaken in our timeline with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Any non-aggression pact with Italy and her allies would allow for the Soviets to focus their attention towards the British, French, and Chinese. Better yet, Italian participation in the conflict would actually be in Italy's interests. With the massive Soviet Union on their side, they would be able to gain all the territories that yes-men had determined to be a part of their Greater Italy, while simultaneously gaining a massive sphere of influence in buffer states in the Balkans. Therefore, once Italy had begun making motions towards the Soviet Union, the remaining nations of the Stresa Front would be shocked. The strongman persona that yes-man had attempted to embody would begin to appear far too arrogant to be reasonable. However, this immense opportunity for the Soviet Union would be floundered by Trotsky's ideological rigidity. Once news of Italian overtures to the Soviets were received by Trotsky, he would immediately shoot them down. To his credit and detriment, Trotsky would not work with fashionistas. His Emancipation Proclamation had no exceptions. The unstoppable march of the Red Army would liberate Romania, Yugoslavia, the Balkans, Italy, and then all of Europe. Of course, Trotsky was sure to announce his ambitions publicly, much to the disappointment of the anti-Trotsky conspirators. The outright rejection of the Italian proposal, the careless announcements of liberating the Balkans from capitalism, made things a lot easier for the Stresa Front. The previously tentatively neutral states which had ties to Italy, such as Hungary and Bulgaria, would seek to join the Stresa Front, and therefore the war against the Soviet Union to protect their sovereignty. Their participation in the Stresa Front had also given them a seat to determine the fate of Yugoslavia. Since the League of Nations was still an effective institution, the Yugoslavian crisis was solved by granting a Croatian mandate to Italy, a Serbian mandate to France, and the contested territories of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a mandate under British protection. The remaining claimed territories of Bulgaria, Hungary, and Austria would all be granted to them. Yugoslavia was demolished, and Yugoslavism as an idea was determined to be a failure. This solution is extremely volatile and likely not to last beyond the invasion of the Soviet Union, but it has managed to keep the alliance stable and expanded. The entirety of the Balkans, besides Greece and Albania, were now directly involved in the conflict. The Soviet blitz to the Romanian oil fields would be pushed back, and the connection of French supplies to the Balkans would be re-established. This event is devastating for the Soviet Union and would only get worse once the French had played their trump card. With the Italo-French split avoided, the French would now be able to recommit forces that had been deployed to the Italian border. Now that they've returned to their posts, the French had formally invited the Bavarian Republic to the Stresa Front, which the government had agreed to. After gaining their support, the French announced the proclamation of a rival German government, the Second German Confederation, claiming all the territories of post-Versailles Germany, with some exceptions. Their capital would be Frankfurt, where the 1848 revolutions had organized the First German Confederation. While at first glance this seems like a wholesome move, the French designs on Germany were extremely sinister. There was a new German government, sure, but only as a confederation. The states of the Rhinish, Baden-Württembergian, and Bavarian states would all be members of the Confederation as they were, with only a very weak government in Frankfurt uniting them all. While a Franco-centric initiative, the establishment of the Second German Confederation had considered all major nations' designs on Germany. Following Weimar German territorial claims, Austria would be separate from the Confederation and remain under heavy Italian influence. The Italian influence would also spread to Bavaria, despite the Republican government. Britain would gain the northwestern parts of Germany under their influence, floating around the idea of restoring Hanover, which would become a constitutional monarchy with a member of the royal family at its head. This northwestern influence zone of Britain would also include Holstein as a means to control the Kiel Canal and gain access to the Baltic Sea. Since the French also wanted access to the Baltic Sea, Brandenburg and Pomerania would be republics under French supervision. The region of Saxony would be a Czechoslovak satellite state, and despite aims to eventually integrate Poland into Czechoslovakia, their government in exile would be granted influence over East Prussia as a member of the Confederation, as well as Silesia being jointly administered by the West Slavs. This extremely bleak outcome for Germany would certainly be a possibility in this timeline due to the history surrounding Germany. They had technically avoided the Treaty of Versailles by defecting to the Soviet Union. Now, The stress front would ensure the reparations from this war and the Great War with compound interest. Another reason why this possibility would even be considered is because the Americans weren't involved. Historically, the United States has always preferred having a strong and stable trading partner rather than participating in outright imperialist practices like protectorates or colonies. However, the Europeans may have seen the American attempt to establish an order in Europe along these lines as a failure, reverting back to purely imperialistic prospects. While this may have ruffled the feathers of the American eagle, there was not much they could do. Their proverbial wings would be clipped by the Hoover administration's insistence on isolationism. Now, even the middle and upper classes of America would start to be swayed closer to FDR's point of view, increasing the popularity of the Democratic Party. The precedent for a potential complete sweep in the 1932 elections had been laid. The potentiality had become an obvious inevitability to the Soviet Union. They needed to make a move quickly before their window of opportunity had closed. Thus, Trotsky would order the communist cells within Bavaria to activate, as well as directing Soviet troops to link up with these insurgents. However, once these cells had revolted, they had refused to cooperate with Trotsky. Instead, they would proclaim their own National Bolshevik Revolution. But what could have possibly happened to trigger this sort of response? Hadn't Trotsky regained the loyalty of the Germans with the ascension of Laufenberg? Well, unbeknownst to Trotsky, the region of Franconia would become the hotbed of a new orthodox strain of National Bolshevism. Due to the unique circumstances regarding the rise of Laufenberg to leadership within the NGSSR, the National Bolsheviks who refused to assimilate into the party and rejected Laufenberg would exile themselves into the neighboring neutral Bavaria in order to prevent their persecution. They had chosen Nuremberg as a primary region to move to, as they had begun to see the German fashionista revolt of Mustache Man as a form of National Bolshevism, since their names were so similar, and their preferred method of change, revolution, was attempted by him. While in real life, the differences between German fashion and communism are very distinct, and the lines between our timelines of National Bolshevism and German fashion are clearly adjacent, in this timeline, the differences between these ideologies would be barely existent. While Mustache Man was very adamant in his anti-Bolshevism from the very beginning of his political career, the strict details of his ideology would be illustrated in his book. He wrote this book after he was imprisoned following this failed revolution, and given the warlord period of Germany, there would be little to no time for his ideology to be defined anywhere. Instead, the myths of the failed beer hall putsch would echo in the German zeitgeist, and the vacuum of political representation would be filled by the National Bolsheviks. The beefsteak fashionistas and National Bolsheviks would mingle with each other, exchange ideas, and effectively merge their policies into one unified version, synthesizing together in a way that could only be described by its German counterpart, Gleichschaltung. This process of synthesis would be overseen by Ernst Niekisch, effectively co-opting the Trotskyite communist cells and founding the Orthodox National Bolshevik Party. Under his leadership, Nietzsche would order the National Bolsheviks of Franconia to resist both the Stresa Front and the Trotskyites, accusing them both of colluding to divide Germany. But wasn't Trotsky attempting to unite Germany? Well, we'll get to that. The time that these communists turned National Bolsheviks had spent during their exile had allowed conspiracy theories regarding Jewish people, Trotsky, and the Soviet Union to run rampant. While the claims that the National Bolsheviks in this timeline would share with the German fashionistas of our timeline would be untrue, don't at me, in this timeline, only 2 claims of the National Bolsheviks would actually be true. After all, even a broken clock is right twice a day. One of the theories that the Orthodox National Bolsheviks would assert was that Trotsky had negotiated the Treaty of Trier only as a means to secure power for himself. They argued that if Trotsky had truly sought to pursue the communist cause to the level of passion he claims to have, he would not have signed any sort of ceasefire with the West. Lenin's death forced the power-hungry Trotsky to abandon the front line and therefore abandon Germany. While we as viewers know this to be true given our perspective, the German people of this timeline would not have that level of insight. This theory would begin to resonate more and more across the entirety of Germany, further destabilizing the Soviet Union. Unfortunately for you, it's your turn to be in the dark. The second theory that the National Bolsheviks would proclaim hasn't been revealed yet. For now, we will return back to observing the ramifications of the Bavarian entry into the war. With the non-belligerence of the Bavarian National Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union was unable to reach Munich in time to cut off the Stresa Front's access to Prague, and therefore, the win condition of the Stresa Front was met. By transporting troops through Munich to Prague, the French elite soldiers would form up at the border of the Polish SSR. It was finally time for Trotsky to gain a taste of his own medicine, as the Polish resistance had executed the Warsaw Uprising. Rather than the uprising being abandoned by their supposed benefactors like our history, the Stresa Front would be able to handily use the chaos to quickly control a majority of the Polish SSR. The revolts in Poland would also spread to the Ukrainian SSR, where Ukrainian nationalists would seek to emulate the success of Poland and collaborate with the Stresa Front. But why would these rebellions be so powerful? Well, remember when I was talking about how Trotsky's collectivization measures would be far more strict? Now imagine that on top of that, when the Soviet-European War had begun, he had reinstituted war communism as a means to appropriate resources like grain for the war effort. So the famine that was already underway would be exacerbated as the Red Army seizes the food stores of the starving, pushing more and more of the general populace towards the nationalist insurgents, having lost faith in the Soviet democratic model. In an attempt to prevent the heart of the Soviet Union from being punctured, more troops from the Eastern Front would be deployed to the Western Front. Eventually, all territories of China prior to the Xinhai Revolution would be united under the KMT and their aligned warlords, completing the northern expedition, but not stopping their advance northwards. After the Korean communists were put down, the Japanese would occupy Vladivostok after a prolonged defense, granting the Asians the ability to pursue establishing a rival government. As if that weren't bad enough, the Ukrainian nationalists would begin coordinating with the Stresa Front, with a primary focus of disrupting supply chains to Romania. This enabled the Romanian forces to recapture their occupied lands and liberate them from the Soviet Union. And if that wasn't bad enough, the American elections had been completed, and in a nearly 48-state sweep, FDR was declared victor, becoming president-elect. The threat of direct American intervention in this conflict would spell doom for the first workers' state of the world, and perhaps the workers' revolution in its entirety. This was the final straw. Despite Trotsky's best attempts to deter a convention, the Communist Party would demand that an extraordinary Congress convene within a month in order to discuss the party's response to FDR's election. December 1932. As the Sixth Congress of Soviets of the USSR had commenced, Leon Trotsky felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The failures in Europe, the Stresa Front pushing deeper into the Ukrainian SSR, the separatists in Poland, emboldened by foreign support, and the catastrophe in China. Everything was collapsing. Had his luck finally run out? He licked his lips, took a breath, and began. Comrades, the future we fight for, the liberation of the worker, the unity of the human race is within our grasp. The Stresa Front has made advances into the Union, yes, but do not be deceived. The capitalists are reeling, playing every last card they can play. They cling to their crumbling empires, throwing scraps to the poor instead of granting true power. A ripple of uncertainty in the crowd, but Trotsky would press on. The Great Depression we see in America is only proof of Marx's teachings. The collapse of capitalism is imminent, and our forces have helped accelerate that inevitability. The Democratic Party's candidate, Roosevelt, and his New Deal promised salvation to America. But do not be deceived. Concessions are not revolution. Why beg for crumbs when you can seize the whole loaf? A murmur, no, a shift, uneasy glances. Tension crackled in the air. But Trotsky would not stop. The time for half measures is over. We will not stand idle while our comrades die. The Bolsheviks declare support for all revolutions across Europe and across the Americas. Workers of the world, rise up. We declare war on the United States. Trotsky jerked back. Gasps, screams, the entire chamber erupted into chaos. But a booming voice would cut through the panic. Trotsky's leadership is built on a lie! The door slammed shut. Guards, once loyal, had turned their rifles inward. Trotsky's heart pounded. This wasn't possible. His own men are turning on him. Treason! He roared, but his voice was drowned by the madness of the room. A heavy hand shoved him to the floor. Cold steel slapped around his wrists. Chains. The leader of this coup stepped into the light, none other than Semyon Budonny. His voice was the exact opposite of Trotsky's, measured and calm. The foundation of Trotsky's rule, Lenin's so-called last testament, is a forgery, and we have proof. Slowly and painfully, Trotsky was dragged away from the Congress. His muffled screams of rage had interrupted Comrade Semyon, but once Trotsky was escorted out, there would be no more resistance. Effective immediately, I will assume emergency powers during a transitional period. The warmongering of Trotsky has, evidently, regressed the progress of the workers' revolution, rather than progressing it. He will soon face trial for his treasonous claim for power and his crimes against the workers. From now on, we will pursue a policy of peaceful development as equals to the other nations of the world. His declaration was sharp, certain, direct. Unlike Trotsky's interrupted speech, it had left no room for doubt. The hall was abuzz with supportive cheers and anxious fidgeting. Moscow had already fallen. The coup had been a success. But outside the Soviet Union, the speech had already spread. Those loyal to Trotsky's vision would propagate his final speech to their comrades, until word had eventually reached the United States of America. While Trotsky was cut off from completing his speech, his directives were obvious. So, the communist cells of the United States would execute Trotsky's will. Revolutionary communists all over America had launched attacks in the streets, but their primary target was President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What would the outcome of these communist insurgencies in the United States be? Would the communist movement survive Trotsky's fall? Would the Soviet republics remain loyal to this new regime? And what would a post-Trotskyite Soviet Union political system be like? Trotsky's leadership is built on a lie. This single booming voice during the 6th Congress of Soviets had defined a turning point in this alternate history. Trotsky had managed to gain leadership of the Soviet Union following his successful conquest of Poland and northern Germany for the workers' state. However, the legal precedent of his ascension, the citation of Lenin's last testament, has been disputed by the Soviet military. Despite Trotsky's best attempts to eliminate the internal threat through purges and army restructuring, the coup d'etat managed to go without a hitch. All loyalist members of Trotsky's clique, including his general secretary, were imprisoned, taking the place of formerly imprisoned intellectuals who had dared to doubt Trotsky's directives. People like the leader of the opposition, Bukharin, and skeptics like Rykov. Regardless of potential malformations of Marxism, none of this would have mattered if the Soviet Union were to fall. Thus, these debates and the establishment of a new Soviet constitution would wait until the Workers' War was abandoned for the sake of peace. But would the Stresa Front accept any peace that involved the continued existence of the Soviet Union? How much would the Soviet Union be willing to concede for peace? And what would the ramifications of Trotsky's deposition mean for the world? The anti-Trotsky coup was led by Semyon Budonny, a prominent member of the military during the Revolutionary War. He was one of the few old guard members of the military who survived Stalin's purges, and had actively supported Stalin in his targeting of prominent leaders like Tukhachevsky. The frequent diversion of forces, as well as invading Europe at all, had led to these disgruntled generals to blame Trotsky for their failure, and after these dissident military men met with the political opposition, they would collude to execute the coup with the premise that Lenin's last testament, that he and his allies had uncovered, was a fabrication. Now, in our history, the legitimacy of Lenin's last testament is contested between Marxists-Leninists, also known as Stalinists, and Trotskyists. I want to give a big disclaimer. I'm not making a claim in either direction. While I have my own opinions, this is a fictional story, and it's not an appropriate way to share them. This is because I don't want to use my story to persuade anybody. This is a fictional story that uses history as inspiration, encouraging political thought, but is not a political statement in and of itself. Regardless of whether or not Lenin's last testament was true, Bedoni's government would assert it as a falsity, and any who had denied this fact would be considered an enemy to the Soviet Union. But despite the assertion, there had to be proof. In this case, a member of Trotsky's former triumvirate, Kamenev, had confessed as much. This betrayal of the triumvirate had given Bedoni's government the justification to imprison Zinoviev as well. Kamenev had decided to defect not only due to Trotsky's brazen foreign policy, but his shift towards purging the right opposition and the amnesty that he provided for the National Bolsheviks of Germany. In exchange for this plea deal, Kamenev goes free, but is forced to retire from politics. After the imminent political threats were dealt with, Bedoni's government had two goals: peace and restoring the pre-Trotsky coup government. First, the Soviet Union would turn to the Asians. With their seizure of Vladivostok, the Japanese supported white movement remnants were eager to establish their own rival government. Due to the delicate political scenario following Trotsky's deposition, this had to be avoided at all costs. Therefore, the Soviets would offer the Asians this compromise. The Far Eastern Republic would be re-established as a neutral buffer state. The revival of this Lenin-era directive to their rivals in the East was a solution that benefited the Soviets a substantial amount, and would put the Japanese in a situation where they would be denied the acquisition of territory besides northern Sakhalin. If it were up to Japan only, they would have rejected this proposal. However, due to European involvement and American pressure, this compromise would be adopted, and thus, the Soviet Union was at peace with the East Asian Alliance. Chiang Kai-shek and his united front with the Japanese had managed to pay off in an extremely beneficial way. While he had remained the sole legitimate government of China following this war, there was still a major problem of lack of compliance with regional warlords, especially in the Fen-Tian clique, who has been influenced by Japan heavily. This dynamic is one we'll explore in more detail in the epilogue. For now, we'll observe how the Soviet Union manages to negotiate peace with the Stresa Front. While the Eastern Front was relatively easy to resolve, the Stresa Front would be far more difficult to negotiate with. Since the Soviet Union would want to maintain control over northern Germany as a means to continue their industrialization, the Soviet Union would be seeking to establish the borders that were agreed upon in the Treaty of Trier. The Western powers would argue that if Bedoni had truly wished to reverse all of Trotsky's measures, they had withdrawn from northern Germany and Poland, as those acquisitions were gained due to his treachery. However, if the Soviet Union had accepted this solution, they would be without their main industrial regions. Therefore, the Soviet Union under Bedoni would continue to attempt negotiations with the Stresa Front, despite their ambitions of peace. Just after the anti-Trotsky coup, the Stresa Front believed the war was won. However, the battle-hardened Eastern veterans were now flooding into Europe, threatening a pro-Soviet ceasefire. What was initially seen as a boon for the Stresa Front's ambitions now seemed to be a second wind for the communist cause. While Trotsky may have been removed from power, he was still correct in his assertion that the Western powers were on their last legs. The United States has already begun opening their markets and beginning diplomatic overtures to the Europeans, but any such deals with the United States threatened the Stresa Front's economies to be completely subjugated by the industrial titan. This threat of economic subjugation in the already beleaguered home front had led to the perfect conditions for a communist revolution to take place. Britain herself would see some serious escalation in their industrial regions, threatening the security of the empire. Thus, when the idea of allowing for the Soviet Union to peace out with the Stresa Front in the Soviets' favor had been breached, many had seriously started to consider the possibility. But after a serious political development in Germany, the geopolitical scenario had rapidly shifted. Bedoni's Soviet Union had publicly announced their ambitions for a white peace, restoring the pre-war borders, and a restoration of pre-Trotsky's policies. Both of these things had gone directly against the German communists' desires. A peace alongside the terms of the Treaty of Trier would ensure that the Soviets would never attempt to unite Germany, and would continue to abuse German labor for the sake of industrializing Russia. That, and since they had promised to reverse all Trotsky-era decisions, this would mean that the former National Bolshevik politicians who had assimilated themselves into the Communist Party following Trotsky's amnesty would be removed or potentially jailed for their heretical thoughts. This delicate political scenario had manifested into organized resistance from the North German SSR. Heinrich Laufenberg, who had denounced the Bedoni government, claiming their government as illegitimate, and as a result, called for a vote of secession from the Soviet Union. This call to secede had triggered the Bedoni government to begin turning on the NGSSR as if they were nationalist insurgents. Heinrich had expected this, and thus began collaborating with the Franconian National Bolsheviks to form a united front against both the Soviet Union and the Stresa Front. This united front had invited all German patriots, regardless of class or creed, that sought to resist their subjugation and division, an echo of the ideology that Heinrich had professed during the Spartacist revolt, but now with far more morbid consequences. This united front had not simply included the class-conscious and unconscious nationalists, but fashionistas and National Bolsheviks. Perhaps due to this united front, the workers' revolution in Germany would be perverted beyond the point of recognition. Heinrich knew this was a possibility, but he had much preferred an imperfect union of Germans rather than subjugation. This political development was received with mixed excitement between the members of the Stresa Front. Italy and Britain both had celebrated the defection of the NGSSR and had even begun broaching the topic of recognition in order to accelerate the decline of the Soviet Union. But the French would be appalled that these suggestions would even be considered. By allowing for the North German SSR to break away, they were allowing for them to continue avoiding the war reparations that were due from the Great War, and the blood that was shed fighting their mortal enemy would be for naught. The French would accuse the British and Italians of ambivalence for the French and their political concerns, and would claim that direct recognition of the North German SSR would be treasonous to the alliance. Despite these inflammatory calls, the British and Italians would begin establishing friendly relations with the defected republic, agreeing to a truce wherein they would define the borders of Germany properly after the Soviet Union had been dealt with. With a German defection and collaboration with the British, the Jutlandic Peninsula was easily recaptured by the Danish, and with the turmoil of the North German Navy suddenly being insubordinate to the Soviet Union, the British were able to access the Baltic Sea. This unrestricted access had given them the opportunity to begin direct support of the Baltic insurgencies, further destabilizing the Soviet Union. While the Stresa Front may not have agreed on the directives of the North German SSR, the French were still able to push into Poland, fully controlling the former territories of the Polish Soviet Republic. This breakthrough in Poland had allowed for the Ukrainian partisans to gain direct support from the Stresa Front, eventually gaining all territories west of the Dnieper. Despite the windfall of the Eastern divisions, the Soviet Union would now seek a peace that would favor the West. They would recognize the independence of the North German Soviet Republic, withdraw their troops from the Baltics, recognize the Polish Republic, and agree to divide the Ukrainian state between a nationalist republic in the West and keep the East as a part of the Soviet Union. While not a direct stipulation of the treaty, the Central Asian Union republics would also peacefully secede, leaving the Soviet Union with these borders. Eager and satisfied with the defeat of the Soviet Union and the establishment of several buffer states between themselves and their spheres of influence, Britain and Italy both would begin to demobilize and celebrate their victory against communism. However, for France, the war was far from won. Them and their client states were still fighting for their lives against the United Nationalist Front in Germany, as well as supporting the Spanish in the suppression of the United Front. Despite the prolonged conflict, the French would remain at war with the North German SSR. Rather than pursuing their goal of carving up Germany with the help of their European allies, the Second German Confederation's government would be strengthened, uniting the French client states and the Bavarian republics into one unified state, granting the ability for the French to consolidate their administrative regions, regardless of the consent of their former governments. The French objective would be to completely subjugate Germany, restoring democracy to their lands, and granting the Polish their corridor to the sea. It is for this reason that the Czechoslovak and Polish would be on the side of the French in this conflict. The Germans were put into a nearly impossible situation.
the eastern bank of the Rhine would be reoccupied by the French forces, and the industrial region of Silesia was under constant threat. However, a political event in Poland would trigger a catastrophe for the French forces. Despite the French in their endeavors to liberate Poland, there were many Polish nationalists who had extreme disdain for the Zapodoslavian proposal. They would once again be subjugated by a foreign power. Despite the fact that these oppressors would be their kin, and their freedom of worship would be guaranteed, the Polish people would resist such ideas, demanding complete independence. Thus, the Polish would fall to a national syndicalist revolution, directly in opposition to the French and their Zapodoslavian project. While their foreign policy was still extremely in line with the French, their distrust of France's political designs would restrict their ability to cooperate. It didn't help that this Polish breakaway state would be recognized by Italy nearly immediately as an ideological ally. With the sudden shift of government in the Polish Republic, the rump Ukrainian state would begin to eye out the contested region of Lviv. The Ukrainians could tolerate a democratic Zapadoslavia governing their kin, as they would certainly grant them autonomy in their federation. But this Polish nationalist republic's intentions were extremely anti-minority. Due to concerns of their kin being oppressed, the young Ukrainian republic would begin moving against the Polish. Seeing an opportunity to trigger a cascade of defensive alliances in favor of Italy and their sphere of influence, Italy would begin to support Poland in this crisis, leaving a potential entry of Italy on the side of the German National Union, granting them the exact opportunity they had been hoping for with the Soviet Union. Once again, Yes Man's strong-headedness had proven to be a problematic element of Italy's foreign policy, but the Yugoslavian debacle had already put a serious strain on Franco-Italian relations, so this development should be expected. With the threat of the just barely negotiated peace of the Soviet Union falling apart months afterward, the League of Nations would convene to ensure that the Franco-German War would end as soon as possible. Fearing international retaliation, France would back down, and peace negotiations would begin between the French and Germans. In the end, the first Treaty of Trier would be used as a baseline for the second. Following their initial stipulations, none of the states of Germany should claim to be the sole Germany. Therefore, the German National Union would accept their status of being Northern Germany once again, and in exchange, the Second German Confederation would be dissolved. However, due to French stubbornness to achieve victory, they had already made significant political malformations. As a result, Baden-Württemberg no longer existed. Instead, Baden and Swabia would spawn from the Second Confederation, leaving the former Bavaria with only Augsburg and Munich to their name. Due to the refusal of the French or the North Germans to accept any neutral Bavaria, much rather retaining control over their gained territories directly or indirectly, the accidental partitioning of Bavaria would become official, leaving Germany with these borders. The victory the Stresa Front had allowed for the capitalist nations of the world to breathe the collective sigh of relief. Though the front itself immediately collapsed after the conflict, its purpose had been served. A wall of buffer states now shielded the West from the godless communists of the East. For most nations, that was enough. But one nation had celebrated more than its survival. It had triumphed not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of millions. Italy, under Yes Man's guidance, had preached the dangers of Bolshevism from the very beginning. What had once been dismissed as alarmism for the sake of gaining power had become prophecy. As Europe lay smoldering, it was clear. The title of the ideology of the 20th century had belonged to the fashionable autocrats of Rome, not the godless philosophers of Moscow. The influence of fashion had spread like wildfire, with the Rome Protocols rising to become a true military alliance. Italy's vision was expanded through Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, and now Spain. While France and Britain continued to reel from strikes and political unrest, Italy had remained stable, strong, and seductively simple. Yes Man's triumph was no longer regional, it was cultural. Fashion had become fashionable, with more and more Europeans adopting their style. And soon, the fashion of Europe would spread to America, where even the brightest lights of liberty would begin to flicker in its wake. In the United States, the Great Depression had ground the American dream to dust, with fears of another wave of communist violence. The New Deal had promised salvation, but for many it was too slow and too weak for the crisis at hand. In Europe, decisive men had seized extraordinary powers and rebuilt their nations from ruin. Why couldn't America do the same? And so it was, shortly after his inauguration, that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had addressed the nation with a proposal now known as the Roosevelt Dictatorship. Framed as a temporary emergency measure, to Roosevelt it was a necessary evil. To his supporters it was salvation. To his enemies it was treason. And to one man it was a call to arms. As debate raged on in Congress over the ratification of the dictatorship bill, General Smedley Butler, America's most decorated Marine and a veteran of the Sino-Soviet War, marched from his home in Pennsylvania towards Washington, D.C. Marines who had served under him joined in droves. Veterans of the disgruntled Bonus Army took up his cause. Ordinary citizens, fearful of what Roosevelt's new America may become, rallied behind the man they called the Fighting Quaker. This march had echoed another across the Atlantic, Yes Man's infamous March on Rome. And like that march, it had ended with the nation's leader standing down. Upon reaching the capital, Butler had demanded the National Guard lower their arms. Roosevelt, unwilling to spill American blood at the streets of Washington, ordered for them to stand down, and invited Butler for a conversation. Behind closed doors, the two men met. No record exists of their conversation, but shortly thereafter, an announcement was made that stunned the nation. For the remainder of Roosevelt's term, the leadership of the United States would be shared. Roosevelt would remain president, but Smedley Butler would assume the newly created role of Secretary of General Affairs, a position whose powers, while undefined, would come to shape the future of American democracy, or perhaps its end. What is the Secretary of General Affairs? Why did Roosevelt agree to stand down? Why did Smedley Butler, a lifelong defender of democracy, lead a coup? Who had put him up to it? And what comes next for America and the world?
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
In our history, in the year 1934, Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history at the time, had blown the whistle on what he called the business plot, where several large business owners who feared FDR's policies destroying their wealth had wished to establish a dictatorship instead. While the validity of his claim, that a business plot had existed at all, is contested to this day, Smedley had put his entire legacy on the line to prevent these alleged plotters from destroying American democracy. Smedley holds a very special place in our history, because regardless of the business plot's legitimacy, if it was true, his actions of exposing the plot would cement his place in history as a hero. But in this alternate timeline, Smedley has gone through with the plot. Shortly after FDR's inauguration, he became the Secretary of General Affairs, a super-constitutional dictatorial position which gives him a blank check to preserve law, order, and democracy? What could have caused this stubborn adherent of democratic institutions to become a dictator? Why would a vocal critic of capitalism collaborate with its kingpins? How would this dictatorship even work? What happens to FDR's presidency? And how will the rest of the world react? In our history, the United States of America had faced the Great Depression, which had destroyed the quality of life for countless American citizens. The Hoover presidency was disastrous for the crisis, as his insistence on refusing to use the federal government as a tool to combat employment had arguably elongated the suffering of many. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt had begun his campaign for presidency, he advocated for a New Deal, where the federal government would create several different institutions with the sole purpose of helping the economy recover. In order to fund these projects, as well as hopefully address the financial crisis, Roosevelt had vowed to end the gold standard, transferring the U.S. currency to a fiat one, allowing for the government to print money as needed to address the crisis. Upon news of this, allegedly, big on the allegedly, several large business owners had taken action to organize a coup against FDR. While the term fashionista had been thrown around quite a lot, it seems like the plotters had only cared for the effects of a fashionable regime on their ability to do business, rather than any sort of understanding of the ideology itself. I make this claim since out of all people to approach for the coup, for some reason, they picked Smedley Butler. While Smedley Butler certainly had the charisma to hypothetically lead a dictatorial nation, he had none of the motive or the ideology. Smedley was famous for his small books like War is a Racket, where he had self-confessed himself to be a racketeer for capitalism. According to Smedley, after he was approached by the plotter's intermediary, he had played along for as long as he could while gathering evidence and testimony. However, once he had officially blown the whistle, none of the suspected plotters would be called to the stand. Instead, only the intermediary had testified. And while there is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and may have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient,
During the committee, they had said, "The committee will not take cognizance of names brought into testimony which constitute mere hearsay."
While Smedley's actions may have brought him extreme ridicule, if he was telling the truth, he could have prevented the utter destruction of democracy in America. And it's for this reason that I commend Smedley for speaking out. While Smedley may not have gone through with this hypothetical plot, in this timeline he had. Why? Well, there are two major reasons behind my decision making. Due to the point of divergence, Smedley Butler had been directly fighting the Soviet Union. He would have been positioned in the Tianjin garrison, and would see him fighting Chinese and Russian communists by surprise. And since Tianjin had fell, the Marines there would need to be evacuated, either continuing to support the fight against the Soviets, or be sent back home to recover. In order to adjust Smedley's mental state to the point of agreeing to perform a coup against a democratically elected official, I believe it would make sense for Smedley to return home after being injured. In our history, after Smedley had retired from the military, he had reflected on his actions as a US Marine and realized that he was a racketeer. I believe that in this timeline, while he may have had some sort of realization that he was advancing American business interests, he may not have come to the same conclusion as our history, seeing as communists had injured him and ended his decorated military career early. However, this alone isn't enough. Even if someone is shell-shocked, they are still themselves deep down, and Smedley was a hot-blooded American. He wished to vote, speak his mind, and guarantee those liberties for others.
My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write.
It was one of the reasons why he had become a soldier. He believed that by fighting for America, he was fighting for liberty. So what could have possibly forced his hand? Well, the only thing that could. Believing he was overthrowing dictators and guaranteeing the rights of his American kin. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this video so far. If you want to see more narrative-focused alternate history like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and I would love to continue to make content for you all. Thank you for your consideration. Let's get back to the video. Imagine that you're Roosevelt. You had recently won a nearly 48-state sweep election, and as a result, communist paramilitaries had sprung across the entire nation, seeking to destroy the American dream and you in the process. But after a short amount of time, the conflict in Europe had subsided. The communist threat was handled, and it was all thanks to the European democracies abandoning their liberal values in the face of destruction from communists. This observation had been noted by the common American man as well, and now they look to you to execute your vision for America, your New Deal, with the force of a dictatorship, temporarily, in order to ensure America's survival of the Great Depression. Even in our history, without the Soviet hordes nearly occupying all of Europe, there was a strong movement in America which had advocated for a temporary dictatorship. Now, with these conditions, the call for dictatorship in America, I predict, would be far higher. But was there ever even the consideration that Roosevelt should become a dictator? In our timeline, even before Roosevelt had been elected, his vice president, John Nance Garner, also known as Cactus Jack, had proposed the idea of a presidential dictatorship to Congress. This Roosevelt dictatorship would allow the president the unilateral authority to suspend congressional appropriations, abolish government departments, dismiss civil servants at his discretion, and reduce statutory appropriations and contractual payments, with Congress only able to check such measures with a 2/3 supermajority in both houses. In our timeline, this was obviously denounced by the Republican leader in Congress, and after enough pushback, the entire idea was scrapped, with the only remaining evidence of such ideas existing in archived Wikipedia articles or several small hearsay documents. It's also worth noting that this idea may not have been embraced by FDR at all. There are some hints that this may have been the case, but I believe that his actions prove that he decided against it for the sake of preserving American democracy. However, I believe in this timeline, given the point of divergence allowing for us a messianic rise of yes man, and the direct threat of socialism destroying the American way of life, Roosevelt would consider the Roosevelt dictatorship option as a genuinely well-intentioned and reasonable response to the terrors of the Great Depression. Therefore, Roosevelt would push the bill forward to Congress, triggering Smedley Butler to act. This would have been occurring while Smedley would have been in contact with McGuire, the business plot's alleged middleman. The idea that if Smedley hadn't acted, a dictator would rise in his nation would spur him to action, collaborating with the business plot, but with his own motives in mind. Now we've caught up with the events of Chapter 37.
Smedley Butler has successfully performed his March on D.C.
and has become the Secretary of General Affairs, a dictatorial position with even more power than Roosevelt had even considered. But Smedley would convince himself and his supporters that he would only use these powers to prevent a dictatorship. Regardless of the hypocrisy, Smedley would take action to preserve American democracy. According to Smedley's testimony, the Secretary of General Affairs would be a dictatorial position, but democracy would not have been destroyed. The president would still exist, but would only function as a figurehead. The Soga would be able to enact policies, but the policies that he would enact would be presented as if he was an assistant to the president, even if the legal authority was dubious. It's worth noting that the Constitution itself wouldn't even recognize any sort of Soga without a constitutional revision. This position was made out of thin air, and therefore, legally, the position would hold no power. Smedley would actually accept this, as any sort of cementing of this temporary position in the Constitution would go against everything he stood for. Instead, Smedley would only use his powers in a very limited fashion. The first actions he would take would be to kill the dictatorship bill immediately, and reverse the decision to abandon the gold standard in order to appease his benefactors. However, he couldn't do much else. Roosevelt would have won a popular vote not seen in American politics up until this point. Even Smedley voted for him. If he were to enforce an impeachment, citing his consideration of dictator as the cause, he would be going directly against the democratic process in his nation. Instead, the question of impeachment would be left to the Democratic and Republican parties to consider, without his intervention. Due to the hesitancy of Smedley to force any major changes, there would be a small lame duck period, where Roosevelt would remain as president for his term, but would not be allowed to run again. After the next election, the position of Soga would be destroyed, and the democratic process would begin as normal. For the entirety of the 1933 to 1937 term, Roosevelt and Smedley would work together to give the promised New Deal to America, with each ensuring the other was not advancing their own agendas in secret. The backbone of this regime would be the American Legion, a veterans organization loyal to Smedley Butler, which frequently grows as more and more independent organizations fold into the Legion. While Smedley's strength grows, independent from the plotters, they needed to find an alternative pathway to gain their desired governmental revision. Therefore, they would begin attempts to gain more influence in the Senate and Congress. This would manifest into the foundation of the American Liberty League, a bipartisan movement of anti-Roosevelt politicians. Now, in our timeline, it's extremely likely that this coalition was not involved in any sort of nefarious plot. However, according to Smedley Butler's testimony, a member of the plot claimed that an official political movement would form against FDR, and shortly after Smedley claims the statement was made, the American Liberty League was formed. As we're already taking every statement of Smedley as truth in this hypothetical scenario, we will have the ALL be the primary political arm of the plotters. While Smedley may have been acting in his own interests, despite the plotters putting him up to it, the plotters would be able to start nefariously influencing these politicians to encourage a constitutional revision, to entrench the Secretary of General Affairs as a legitimate institution, despite Smedley's wishes. Smedley would begin to notice his posturing against himself. The plotters have started to perceive Smedley as a tool that needs to be discarded before he takes any actions against them. While the most obvious decision would be to simply resign, he could not. There's a legitimate threat that Roosevelt would simply reinstate his dictatorship bill, and Smedley would not wish for that to happen. Instead, Smedley would need to patiently wait for his time to stand down. After the 1936 elections elect a new president besides Roosevelt. However, with the blatant posturing of the plotters, there's a serious potential that one or both parties' candidates for the 1936 elections would be ALL members, and therefore be colluding with the plotters. Smedley is now fighting a subversive battle, a race against time to determine whether or not the actions he's set in motion end in victory for the plotters, or he manages to properly expose these plotters and ensure the democratic process in America. While Smedley and the plotters begin to fight their war in the shadows, a rapidly pro-constitutional and democratic faction will begin to form, the American Restoration Coalition, the ARC. Much like the ALL, this organization would be a bipartisan one, including members of the Republican and Democratic Party who had despised Smedley for his actions against the Republic. However, they would not wish to incite a revolution. Believing that Smedley was truthfully going to step down from his position after the 1936 elections, the ARC would focus heavily on mutually promoting their own Democratic and Republican candidates. These candidates would include progressive Republicans like William Borah, but also the heavily controversial Huey Long! Huey Long was a prominent Democratic Party candidate who was known for his authoritarian leanings, but had an extreme and burning desire to make every man a king. While he was assassinated in our history, in this timeline he would survive any attempts, being far more prepared after Trotsky's inciting of unrest in the USA. Huey Long would join the ARC in order to advance his political agendas. Since most of his policies were similar to FDR's New Deal, Huey would fill the political vacuum of Democrats who wished to have a strong intervention by the federal government, who now could not vote for the controversial FDR in the next election. Due to this political vacuum, the ARC may determine Huey to be their frontrunner in the 1936 election. However, the Republicans of the ARC would push for a less authoritarian candidate, claiming that Huey would simply act the same way which FDR had hoped to, with more experience given his tendencies. As debate regarding who the ARC would push to become elected raged on, Smedley would begin to covertly support their organization, with hopes that if Smedley fails to defeat the plotters, the more politically experienced ARC would be able to ensure the democratic nature of the USA. This delicate balance of power in America is a scenario I would love to delve more into this hypothetical Season 2 of German October, Semper Fidelis. But that's out of the scope of this video. Instead, we must begin to look at the rest of the world and discover the ramifications of Trotsky's Workers' War in Asia and Europe. While the Stresa Front had remained united against the Bolshevik threat, the controversial decision of Britain and Italy to recognize the North German breakaway state had caused the alliance to fall apart. And now that the major threat, the Soviet Union, has been significantly weakened, the precedent for a second Stresa Front is gone. Instead, each of these nations would begin to pursue their own objectives, attempting to sway each of their former allies to their side. Italy had managed to gain significantly from the Stresa Front. Their new alliance, the Rome Protocols, have expanded to include a significant portion of Europe. Notably, they had included all the nations who were significantly impacted by the post-war treaties and wished to reclaim their territory from those who benefited, whom were in the Little Entente, led by France. Of course, France would not want this Entente to be little. They would do everything in their power to attempt to gain Britain's favor. But due to Britain's own political scenario, they would seek to withdraw from continental affairs and consolidate their empire. Due to the unrest seen at home and in the colonies regarding communist revolutionaries, and the funding of this war against the Soviet Union taking a significant economic toll on the empire, the British had begun to see these foreign entanglements as threats to the empire's continued existence. It's for this reason that our timeline's turtleneck man had proposed a referendum which advocated for corporatist, autarkic principles meant to solidify the empire. The focus on corporatism is clearly fashion-inspired, and it's safe to assume that this would lead to the British Union of Fashionistas to be founded. However, I believe that due to the several divergences from our timeline, this wouldn't happen in the same way. Before Turtleneck Man had founded the Union of Fashionistas, he had attempted to found a splinter party from the Labour Party, known as the New Party. The New Party had adopted his memorandum and had some moderate support. However, it failed to get enough traction, which led to his full adoption of fashion. In this timeline, due to the timing, the rise of National Bolsheviks taking the place of German fashion, and the nature of other British fashionistas, I believe that many would see Mosley's turn away from social democracy towards an isolationist economic recovery focused plan as the true path forward. Therefore, Mosley would become prime minister under his new party rather than adopting fashion. That isn't to say he would be against fashion altogether. He would certainly look favorably upon many fashion groups in Britain, and is far more likely to join the Rome Protocols rather than the Little Entente. However, his program required peace, and a lack of reliance on foreign resources. Thus, Britain under Turtleneck Man would be isolationist. The potential of him losing the election towards a Francophilic leader would change this course. But for now, France was on their own. With Britain falling to a fashion-sympathetic leader and the rise of fashion all across Europe, the natural assumption would be that France would adopt their own form of fashion. However, the frequent antagonism that Italy had put France under would make fashion extremely unpopular in France. Instead, the nationalists who had been swayed to the ideology in our timeline would become more moderate, embracing the Republic's democratic institutions as a means of preserving the French state. This would manifest into an electoral victory for the our timeline, at least in this period of history, fashionista François de Larac. The rise of Larac was made far easier than our timeline due to his organization, the Cross of Fire. The Cross of Fire had been favored by French nationalists for their aid in suppressing pro-Soviet insurgencies. However, many would be appalled that these paramilitaries were being celebrated for violence against their own countrymen. They would argue that Laroc's party was no different than Italian fashion at all. In order to alleviate their concerns, Larac would continuously attempt to respect the institutions of the Republic, allowing for France to be strong against their mortal enemy of Germany. France would begin attempting to shift Spain's course away from a full adoption of fashion by supporting the conservative parties that were, as of yet, not illegal in their state, as well as supporting their new German client states. However, one of these states would chafe under the French. It should be no surprise that Bavaria would resent the French for their actions. The Second Treaty of Trier had led to the Bavarian state to lose half of its territory. What would be a surprise is that the man leading the Republic was Ruprecht, the Crown Prince of Bavaria. While Ruprecht was a staunch liberal who had disdain for Mustache Man's beer hall putsch and was the head of House Wittelsbach, the rightful rulers of the Kingdom of Bavaria, he would be the dictator of the Republic of Bavaria. This had actually almost happened in real life, as during the worst phases of the Great Depression, an idea was floated around that the previously democratic government should instead be led by Ruprecht, who had pleased the conservatives and social democrats due to his monarchical heritage and focused on liberal ideals respectively. In our history, Mustache Man had begun to solidify his regime, so this idea was shelved. But in this timeline, it would become the ultimate way for Bavaria to play both sides in the Franco-Italian diplomatic conflict. By being a dictator and flirting with the ideals of Austro-fashion, he could align himself with Italy and prevent their immediate destruction. But they could also play to their liberal aspects and seek to regain their territories and perhaps a leading position in their attempt to destroy the National Bolsheviks. Regardless of the ambitions of Ruprecht, the Bavarians would need to go to war with the North Germans before potentially reuniting their state. While it would be so much easier if they only had to fight the Germans alone, many had feared that the Soviet Union may attempt a détente with their former industrial epicenter. After the Soviet Union had faced their unfortunate peace, surprisingly, the Bedoni government had stepped down, restoring the pre-Trotsky coup chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Rykov, and due to popular demand from the party, Bukharin would be appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Thus, political debates concerning the future of the Soviet Union had begun. As mentioned previously, the ideology of Trotsky being extremely discredited had given the ideology of permanent revolution a blow that it could never recover from. Instead, advocates of socialism in one country would become ascendant. Case in point, the ascension of both Rykov and Bukharin to positions of extreme influence in the USSR. With Rykov and Bukharin as heads of the USSR, the previously shunned policies of pro-peasant agrarian populations would be taken by the weakened USSR, allowing for them to begin to recover from the famine. They would also restore the new economic policy as a means to allow for the Soviet Union to recover. This measure would allow for capitalist structures, with, of course, severe restrictions, to exist in the Soviet Union, but this time indefinitely. But besides the restoration of the NEP, the constitution itself would need to be rewritten. However, due to the lack of a proper unified vision or ideological authority steering the ship of the Soviet Union, the proposed revisions by several party members had led to a major deadlock. What all members of the party could agree upon in this constitutional revision is that the Union itself needed to be more centralized. Due to the nature of the Leninist model of collective leadership, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars had to appeal to as many republics as possible. This had the adverse effect of fueling Trotsky's expansionism, and simultaneously the alienation of several other communist movements in foreign nations. While well-intentioned, this idea of collective leadership had to be removed in favor of a more centralized model. Among these centralization measures would include the revocation of the Union Republic's right to secede. This policy would be undertaken as a means to ensure the critical security failure of North Germany's secession could not and would not happen again. This measure would also alleviate some of the pressure put on the CPC to accommodate the Union Republic's wishes, further centralizing power. With this announcement of the centralization policies and reversal of the Korean-Silesia policy, the Transcaucasian SFSR had faced serious instability issues. The Transcaucasian nations were all united under an SFSR. After the Stalin Constitution, the borders of the Azerbaijani, Georgian, and Armenian states would be solidified, and administered directly from Moscow, rather than locally. However, border conflicts and other issues between groups had remained. This caused several insurgencies in the region, restricting the Soviets' capabilities to use the resources of the Caucasus to their full advantage, and occupying the military, which would slow down their ability to begin campaigns of reconquest. It should be no surprise that the Soviet Union wishes to reclaim their territories. Although the extent of the claims varied by different politicians, all agreed that the bare minimum for reconquest would be to annex the Ukrainian state and reunite with the Far Eastern Republic. The Far Eastern Republic itself is an extremely unstable, barely functioning state. Their state only continues to exist thanks to the heavy support from America and Japan, whom both wish to bring into their sphere of influence, but can only manage to enforce their neutrality. While Japan would be more focused on getting their loyalist white movement in charge of the state to reclaim Russia for their alliance, the peace treaty between the Soviet Union and the Asian Alliance, overseen by the Americans and British, had demanded that both the Communist Party and any other white movements to be banned. This stipulation was vital for peace, as if either one of these movements were to become the leaders of the buffer state, a war between the Soviets and the Asians would begin once again. Of course, Japan would be extremely against this arrangement. However, the perceived vulnerability in the presence of Japanese troops in China has led to the doctrine of Hokushinran becoming far more viable of an option. In our history, the Japanese military was split between two different expansion doctrines, the Northern and the Southern doctrines. While the government was initially supportive of the northern expansion route as a means to gain the heavy metals needed for their army, the Navy had eventually won enough influence to convince the government to pursue their southern expansion by gaining the vital resources of rubber and oil for the Navy. In this timeline, due to the ill-prepared, hasty invasion of China and Japan's support, the opinion of the Japanese government would be heavily in favor of continuing expansion northwards. However, a diplomatic event in Asia would shift the direction of Japan. After the defeat of the Soviet Union, the only remaining national claimant to China was Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. Now known by his title of Generalissimo for his victory against the Soviet Union, would proclaim that China was united under his rule. However, this would barely be the truth. Their primary military arm during the conflict of the Soviet Union would be warlords. While they had defended China and recognized Chiang's government, it was only under the condition that they would keep their petty polities. The problem of conditional loyalty from the warlords would be exacerbated by foreign influence. For example, the Buddhists of Tibet would be a satellite state of the British after their support of their regime, and the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement granted Japan special privileges in northern China. Therefore, the Imperial Japanese Army would be entrenched in the regions of Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Manchuria, effectively making these regions and their warlords loyal to Japan. In our timeline, Chiang had always sought to eliminate the communists before eliminating the Japanese threat. However, he was forced into a second united front by his generals. Because the Soviets invaded during the Northern Expedition, the communists had been dealt with, and now Chiang would turn his attention towards Japan. In an attempt to begin centralization and improve the strength of his government, Chiang would demand a renegotiation of the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement. The Japanese would utterly refuse such demands, as the Japanese soldiers had fought to truthfully defend China. To be denied their agreement would be disrespecting the Japanese soldiers who had died defending Chinese sovereignty. This seemingly minor disagreement would soon escalate to a civil war, as the pro-Japanese faction of the Kuomintang, who hadn't been purged due to the point of divergence, had proclaimed their rival government and began collaborating directly with Japan. The northern regions, which already had Japanese troops present, would immediately recognize Wang Jingwei's government, and several warlords who had historically resisted Chiang Kai-shek during the Central Plains War would defect to his government as well. Fearing Japanese ambitions of imperialism in Asia, the British would begin supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government, much like they had in our history. However, with the increased legitimacy of Wang Jingwei's government as compared to our history, as well as the already present Japanese troops in China, the potential for Chiang's government to maintain control is extremely unlikely. During this chaos, the dormant communist cells would claim control over Shaanxi, the very same region Mao Zedong had controlled after the Long March. However, their ideology would be shaped by the events in Germany, therefore taking a far more National Bolshevik position as compared to the previously Trotsky-centric movement. This ideological deviation is proof that the German deviation was being recognized as an ideology independent from Marxism-Leninism, whilst still claiming some form of succession. After the chaos of the Workers' War, Germany was still disunited. The Second Treaty of Trier was not much different than the first, and the largest nation in the region was unable to claim national unity. However, this nation was finally free. German labor would no longer facilitate the elevation of the Russians from their savagery. Instead, German workers would benefit the Germans, and soon their full force would be unleashed. Their armies would unite all Germans under one banner and spread their revolution to the rest of their kin in Europe. The fact that this rhetoric is being espoused at all should make it obvious that Heinrich Laufenberg's decision to unite with the Franconian National Bolsheviks had led to the destruction of the workers' revolution in Germany. Despite his attempts to advocate for his form of National Bolshevism, which is similar to Maoism, he would be continuously defeated in debates against the orthodox Franconian National Bolsheviks. Eventually, the stress would be too much for Heinrich. He would announce that he'd step down once the constitution had been penned and a proper successor to the North German National Council Republic be proclaimed. While officially the united front of several varying parties would present their candidates, there was clearly only one man who had enough political power to succeed Heinrich: Ernst Niekisch of the Franconian Nazbols. With the ascendance of Niekisch, the state was quickly transformed to be a one-party state, merging the two National Bolshevik parties into one, whilst accepting socialists and nationalists who had demonstrated a loyalty to their ideology. The remaining politicians who refused to fall in line would be soon purged with an event similar to the Night of the Long Knives. Yet, oddly enough, a majority of those whom were purged by Mustache Man in our timeline would become the backbone of the National Bolsheviks, like those under Ernst Röhm, and the Strasser brothers would be integrated into the German National Bolshevik Party, strengthening their party with their influence. But there would be one man who would gain a substantial amount of influence, a doctor who has his roots in political theories, with deep understandings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Rosa Luxemburg, whose oratory and propagandic skills would haunt our living world to this day. I, of course, am talking about Dr. Turkey. In our timeline, Dr. Turkey had not been interested in German fashion under Mustache Man until after he had faced trial for his failed beer hall putsch. Since Mustache Man had died following an anti-fashion coup in Bavaria at around this time, Dr. Turkey would not be able to directly align with fashion. Even if he had heard of Mustache Man's theories, there wasn't much he could do once he was dead. It's possible that Dr. Turkey would even celebrate the conquest of northern Germany by the Soviet Union. However, once Trotsky had taken charge and ran the Soviet Union to the ground through his leadership, he would be more convinced of his anti-Semitic stances. This would all come to a head as the Franconian National Bolshevik Revolution had begun. The admiration that Dr. Turkey would have for Mustache Man in our timeline would instead be directed towards Nikesh, as the orthodox National Bolsheviks would adopt Mustache Man's ideological aspects while still praising the Leninist Bolshevik Revolution. Now, this seems incredibly unlikely. Anybody with a basic understanding of history would be right in assuming that a prominent German fashionista, one of Mustache Man's closest allies, would be anti-anything Bolshevik. Yet, we have crazy quotes like this coming out of Dr. Turkey after he joined Mustache Man's party. You can argue he was just saying this to get more Germans to vote for their party, and it's completely valid. However, the fact that he was even able to say this, I think, is pretty significant. There's no way in hell I'm repeating it. It's for this reason that I believe Dr. Turkey would become a very prominent member of Nikesh's government, with a high chance of him becoming a future leader of the state. But what would this state's policies be? What is their foreign policy, and how far do their claims go? Well, I can't predict everything, and even if I could, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I think that the easiest way to picture it for yourself is that there generally are timelines fashionable Germany, but this time it's being run by those who have a lot more admiration of socialism and communism than our history. In our timeline, those like Nikesh had desired a greater Germany, with Austria, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, Poznan, and the Sudetenland. However, unlike the German fashionistas of our history, they did not wish to eliminate non-Germans out of their lands through a final solution, rather resolving to assimilate or deport. Rather than annexing all of Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, they believed that the Germans of the East should instead return to the fatherland to help facilitate the demographic shifts that this policy would inevitably cause. The resources available to Germany would be enough to keep a relatively large industry operating. However, many industries in Germany would be heavily inconvenienced by the divorce between themselves and the USSR. While the USSR was not initially industrialized, their access to rare minerals would have provided German industries the ability to develop advanced civilian and military goods. While the USSR was able to benefit from this arrangement, getting them to an industrialization level at around our history's level, now that they were split apart, the Germans would need to trade with the Soviets for their heavy metals. Despite previously hostile relations, Rykov would accept the secession of the North Germans, following the Leninist model of self-determination, in exchange for a mutual defensive pact. The Soviets would trade their heavy metals with Germany in exchange for resources vital to continue their industrialization. This cooling of relations between the Germans and the Soviets had shocked the capitalist world. Despite their incredibly different ideologies, the right communists and the National Bolsheviks would guarantee each other's independence. Many had feared it was only a matter of time before a full alliance was signed, and the Red Terror of the East would crash into Europe once again. What would happen if a second Workers' War were to begin? If it did, how would it? Would France manage to cool relations with Britain or Italy before the inevitable German blitz through their client states? How would the conflict in Asia resolve? Would Chiang's Kuomintang finally unite China without warlords? Or would Wang's desire to modernize with Japan's help only seal China's fate to eternal subjugation? All of these questions could be answered in Project Semper Fidelis. However, whether it would be a video, a nation roleplay, or a Hearts of Iron 4 mod, are up for debate. Regardless of the future of Semper Fidelis, I really hope you enjoyed German October, and please stay tuned for future developments. I would really appreciate any and all feedback that you have for this scenario. I really understand if you're disappointed with the direction. It was going one way for the Soviets and Trotsky, and now it's going this way. I promise that I'll go into more detail and actually show the outcomes that you were probably hoping for in a special episode that will come later, but not soon because I need a break from this project. It's been a really big adventure working on this project. I really want to thank Serov for all of his help. He has consistently been able to be there for me and help explain to me concepts vital to understand Soviet politics and history and National Bolshevism as an ideology. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your help. And while they weren't directly involved in German October, I really want to thank my community, especially the community managers, like the unofficial ones, of Solo Leo and Likas. Very great, thank you very much. Of course, all my moderators as well. And my family for inspiring me and supporting me through this huge endeavor. I really appreciate it.
And I might have been saying, oh, hey, Semper Fidelis, maybe it's a nation roleplay. You guys should know pattern recognition by now. Stressa had a nation roleplay, Bourbon had a nation roleplay, and now the nation roleplay for German October is live now. Or, well, the server is. I'm not even sure how we're organizing it yet. All I know is that we're going to do it. Since I made the end date of German October 1936 and showed a 1937 conflict, it should be kind of obvious that I'm kind of gunning for this to be a Hearts of Iron 4 mod. So what I'm thinking is that this server can start as a nation roleplay, but then could evolve into a Hearts of Iron 4 mod with inspiration by what people do in the nation roleplay. So if you're interested in that, please join. It would be great to have you. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but I just wanted to put it out there. Anyway, I've been yapping long enough. You probably already have gone into the Discord and claimed that, I don't know, Germany. Good luck with getting that. But yeah, thank you again, everybody, for your support in this channel. And I'm looking forward to making more videos in the future. If you're an advocate of an ideology of any kind, read the books that the ideologies are based on. And I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye, Lord Boy.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Press a button.
If you press this button, then it'll stop. Press this on the mouse.
Bye.
Just click here. Press this button.
Good one.
Yeah.